and the water will flow from it for the people to drink. Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massa and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled there and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord in our midst or not?" The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please stand to preach the gospel. Reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus passed through Samaria. He came to the town of Samaria near the plot of the land that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. Jesus, tired from the journey, sat down at the well. It was about noon. A woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" Jews use nothing in common with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said, "If you knew the gift of God and who was saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." The woman said, "Sir, you do not even have a bucket and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it with his children and his flocks?" Jesus answered and said, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. Whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst. The water I give will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to her, "Sir, give me this water so that I may not be thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
When an infant is in the womb, it breathes water. When it comes into the world, then we need to be certain that the water it receives is pure and clean and uncontaminated. In all of the counties in the state of Minnesota, there is concern about contamination in the groundwater. And in some places, it has nitrates that affect infants and unborn children, especially their brain development. When we think about water in our country, in Jackson or Flint or Chicago, when we think about water in Europe, where they can't even run their boats up and down the rivers, when we think of the fires in California and the lack of water, we begin to see that water is a gift from somewhere beyond our control. And then we begin to understand that water, as a resource, is an image
is an image of the power of the love of God to draw us together and realize that 70% of our earth is water and 70% of our body is water. And therefore, not only is the earth sacred and human beings are sacred, but they're bonded by the power of the love of God. When I'm working outside on a hot day and I've gone a couple of hours without water, I feel the emptiness in my body. And when I drink water, I feel that surge of refreshment, almost like healing. And when I receive the gift of the love of God, I feel that refreshment and healing. You and I are invited not only to care for the earth, but to become sources of living water for healing and hope and reconciliation. That the power of the love of Jesus that flowed from his side might fill us up, and that we might become that instrument of refreshment and life and strength for one another. In this Eucharist, we join as one, and we become living water for one another. We offer these prayers and petitions. We pray for the leaders of our nation, for local leaders. We pray for all who affect our groundwater. We pray for all the decisions that they make. Maybe they be wise and work for the common good. We pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our
We pray that we might live in solidarity with those who suffer from lack of clean water, that we might feel their needs and know their wants. We pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
We pray for those who are sick, for Joanne, the mother of Maria, that we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
Please share with us any prayers you wish to offer.
For our immigrants and migrants, refugees as we approach the World Day for Migrants and Refugees. Praise the Lord.
Lord, hear our
For our nation and there be an individual.
We pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our
Lord, hear our prayer. Lord, without you we can do nothing. By the power of your Spirit, help us to serve your kingdom, to love as you would have us do, through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Pray, brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father.
May the Lord accept the sacrifice at your hands for the praise and glory of his name, for our good and the law of his holy church.
Strengthen, we pray, in our holy purpose, your servants who by the cleansing waters of the earth and bestowing of the Holy Spirit of love have today joined to your people. Grant that we might always walk in newness of life. In your compassionate, merciful Father, gather to yourself all your children scattered throughout the world. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit,
Lift up your hearts.
we lift them up to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right and just.
It is truly right and just. Our duty, our salvation, always and everywhere to give you thanks, Holy Father, Lord of heaven and earth, through Christ our Lord. For by your word you created the world. You govern all things in harmony. You gave us the same word made flesh as mediator. He has spoken your word to us and called us to follow him. He is the way that leads to you, the truth that sets us free, the life that fills us with joy. Through your Son, you gather men and women whom you made for the glory of your name into one family, redeemed by the blood of the cross, signed with the seal of the Holy Spirit. Now and for ages unending with the angels, we proclaim your glory, and in joyful celebration we acclaim. Glory be holy and to be glorified in God, who loved the human race, who always walked with us on the journey of life. Blessed indeed is your Son, present in our midst when we are gathered by his love. When, as once for his disciples, so now for us, he opens the scripture and breaks the bread. Therefore, Father most merciful, we ask you to send forth your Holy Spirit to sanctify these gifts of bread and wine, that they may become for us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. On the day before he was to suffer, on the night of the Last Supper, he took bread and giving thanks. He broke the bread and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it. For this is my body, which will be given up for you." In a similar way, when supper was ended, he took the chalice and gave thanks. He gave the chalice to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it. For this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many, for the forgiveness of sin. Do this. Be this in memory of me." The mystery of faith. Therefore, Holy Father, as we celebrate the memorial of Christ, your Son, our Savior, whom you led through his passion and death on the cross, of glory and the resurrection, and whom you have seated at your right hand, we proclaim the work of your love until he comes again. We offer you the bread of life and the chalice of blessing. Look with favor on the oblation of your church, in which we show forth the paschal sacrifice Christ has handed on to us. Granted by the power of your Spirit of love, we may be counted now and until the day of eternity among the members of your Son, in whose body and blood we have communion. By our partaking of this mystery, Almighty Father, give us life through your Spirit. Grant that we may be conformed to the image of your Son. Confirm us in a bond of communion with Francis, our Pope, our Bishop John, our Bishop Barron, all the bishops, with your priests and deacons and your entire group. Grant that all the faithful of the church, looking into the signs of the times by the light of faith, may constantly devote themselves to the service of the gospel. Keep us attentive to the needs of all, that sharing their grief and pain, their joy and hope, we may faithfully bring them the good news of salvation and go forward with them along the way of your kingdom. Remember our brothers and sisters who have died, all the dead whose faith are known to you alone. Admit them to rejoice in the light of your face. In the resurrection, give them the fullness of life. Grant to us, when our earthly pilgrimage is done, that we may come to an eternal dwelling and live with you forever, there in communion with the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, Saint Joseph, her spouse, the apostles and the martyrs and all the saints, we shall praise and exalt you through Christ Jesus, your Son. Through him and with him and in him, O God, Almighty Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours, forever and ever. We do nothing on our own. It's only by the power of God's love and life. At the Savior's command and formed by divine teaching, we dare to say,
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Deliver us, Lord, we pray, from every evil. Graciously grant peace in our day, that by the help of your mercy we may be free from sin and safe from all distress, as we await the blessed hope of the coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Lord Jesus Christ, who said to your apostles, peace I leave you, my peace I give you. Lord, look not on our sin, but look on the faith of your church. Graciously grant her peace, unity in accordance with your will, who live and reign forever and ever. The peace, the joy of our Lord Jesus be with you always.
And with your spirit.
Let us offer to those near us the sign of the peace of Christ.
You take away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us. You take away the sins of the world. Have mercy on us. You take away the sins of the world.
Behold the Lamb of God. Behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb. Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof,
But only say the word, and my soul shall be healed. We
Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, by the power of your sacraments, that we have proclaimed in this celebration the glorious mystery of Jesus' death and resurrection, may profess it in the manner of our life, through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May our God refresh and renew and bless and keep you and your families in his care. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit,
Amen.
let us go in love and peace to serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you to our musicians for sharing their gifts and talents and truth.
Well, it is 10:15, past 10:15 already, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I hope everybody who's here in person got a chance to get some coffee and a little treat. For those who don't know, I'm Isaac Steiner. I'm the Director of Parish Social Ministry at Catholic Charities of Southern Minnesota. And I know I did a little welcome at Mass already, but I had not clicked record yet. So I'm gonna add another welcome here. And on behalf of the Social Concerns Committee and on behalf of Catholic Charities, I'd like to welcome you, those who are in person and those who are joining via Zoom, to our Fall Social Concerns Day, Water, Protecting Our Source of Life. I'd like to just begin by saying it's good to be back together in person for those of us who are. This is the first social concerns event we've had in person since the fall of 2019. Well, I guess we had two smaller events in the spring of 2020, but it's been 2.5 years, and it's really good. I miss being around people for events, so it's good to be back. Before we get into our first talk, there are some just practical details to address. The first is bathrooms are up the stairs and then to the right. And you should feel free to use those whenever you need to. We will be having a break between the first two talks. So at about 11:15, we're hoping to start our break. Some housekeeping items for Zoom. Those who are joining via Zoom will know their microphones are set to mute. Please keep them that way. It helps to prevent any feedback issues with the audio. And then also your webcams are probably turned off now. And feel free to leave them off or turn them on. It doesn't matter, but we are recording it, so you should be aware of that. And then we will be sending the recording out later and sharing the slideshows that the speakers are using as well in a follow-up email. And then lastly, I would recommend for those joining on Zoom to set your view to speaker view. And that can be done by hovering your mouse over the button in the top right corner of the screen and selecting view, and then putting speaker view from the drop down menu. Believe there will be some time at the end of each talk for questions and answer. And so if you'd like to, those on Zoom can put it down in the chat whenever during the talk, and we'll take a look at that when we get to the Q&A section. And I think that is all for the introductions. I do want to say just briefly, thank you to Father Life and to the musicians, and also to Margie for reading for our Mass. It's a very beautiful liturgy and a great way to start off the day. Oh, I'm glad I pulled this up. I almost forgot. We have two quick things before we get into our first presentation. One is that we invited the bishop to the event, and unfortunately, as you may know, the bishop is a very busy man, and he had a prior engagement already. So, but he did send us a statement that he would like me to share with you, so I'll do that now. It says, "Greetings to all those attending the Fall Social Concerns Day on Water. I regret to say that I won't be able to join you today due to a prior commitment, but I'd like to share a few thoughts with you as you begin your day. In laying out my vision for the Diocese of Winona-Rochester, I've often come back to a quote from Pope Benedict XVI, in which he says that the Church does 3 essential things. It worships God, it cares for the poor, and it evangelizes. So I want to begin by letting you know how grateful I am as your bishop for your commitment to promoting charity and justice, especially for the poorest among us. As Pope Francis reminds us in Laudato Si, the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters." It's fitting then that the topic of this study day is on water as our source of life. Water is present throughout the story of salvation, from the great flood to the crossing of the Red Sea, from Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River to the blood and water that flowed from his side on Calvary. And of course, in the sacrament of baptism, water is the sign that we are cleansed of original sin, given new life in the Spirit,
and welcomed into the family of God. Water is such a powerful symbol in our spiritual journey, precisely because it is so essential to our physical well-being. As you may know, I just came from California, where there's been an ongoing struggle with drought and wildfires over the last few years. We could say decades, really. So I'm keenly aware of how important sufficient access to water is and how difficult life can be without it. I guess you could say I've come from the land of drought and wildfires here to the land of 10,000 lakes. But as Minnesotans, we mustn't take for granted the health of our lakes and waterways. We're called instead to be stewards of God's gifts. My prayer for each of you is that this study day will be a source of grace and refreshment for you as you grow in your knowledge of water as our source of life and deepen your commitment to care for all of God's creation. May God bless you, Bishop Barron. And then we do have one video I'd like to share. It's actually, as you know, Laudato Si is, 8 years old now? 9 years old? I'm not even sure. It's been a while. It seems like it was just a little bit ago, but when Laudato Si first came out, the diocese put together a video on care for creation, and so I'd like to share that now because I think it's a brief video, but it's a very beautiful reflection. So.
Started when I was a kid. My dad and my mom, they introduced my brother and I to the outdoors, and we did a lot of our recreation there. And so I find relaxation in it, but it's also, I find the presence of God there. I have to study, like, what do trout eat? Where do trout live? What time of the year do they eat what? And to me, it's almost a little investigation of God in the natural world, that He created this whole system to work this way, and He offers it to me for my enjoyment. So fly fishing it's part relaxation, but it's also part of a connection to God. My soul is lifted in the natural world and fly fishing, and to catch a fish and see its beauty and to let it go again is a great big signal to me of God's love.
When I was ordained a priest, I met a guy right here, Art Lohman. When I was down here fishing one day, he just started chatting with me and he started showing me a little bit about fly casting and improved my fly casting. And then we'd sit in his house and look out the window and we'd wait for the hatch to start. I remember the caddis hatch. And then finally we'd get out there, and I remember that one of the first times this happened, he had a fishery called Henry that was up here in the box pool, he called it. And it was a big trout, probably about a 4 or 5 pound trout. And we got out there one day, we saw that fish rising, and old Art got down in the water, and he says, let me just try a couple of casts, we'll see if I can hook him. And he set the rod, and I'll never forget, that fish ripped downstream so fast. Art tried to turn, and he went face first into the water. Hip boots full, he came up, the fish broke off, and I thought he was going to be mad. And that guy was laughing so hard at that fish. He said, what counts is hooking him. He said, he took my fly and I hooked him, and he took a fly that I tied. So he didn't care if it got away. And then a week later I came out here to fish with him again, and I thought he was going to start crying. He says, Henry's gone. And I said, what happened? He said, that guy caught Henry, and he said, I looked, and here he comes walking down the stream carrying Henry. And the poor Art, it was like somebody just took his best friend.
Pope Francis wrote this latest encyclical, and I think it's important for Catholics because the natural world is a gift that He gave us. We find our food there, we find our shelter there, we find relaxation and refreshment there, we find even bonds with other human beings there. And if I can't appreciate the natural world, if I can't care for it, I think it's difficult to care for other people.
There's obviously a reevaluating, I think, that we have to do as human beings about what we've done with our earth. And I'm talking about our air, I'm talking about the water, I am talking about the earth, the soil, the stuff we dump into our earth. We are definitely not taking care of this earth. I'd rather see us working with God in creation and nature. It's funny because when I'm standing in a trout stream and I'm in water up to my rib cage and my chest waders, and I feel that water flowing around me in that trout stream, I feel like I'm part of creation. I feel the power of earth in that water. I'm standing in the middle of fish and insects that are floating by me, and I feel like I'm just simply part of that whole nature in which I live. And I should not see myself as better than or greater, or that I should necessarily be control. I should be working with all the creation that God gives me, that we all would be a better existence, a better creation.
The Pope is telling us, like, we have this common home. We don't just live as passerbys in this and just use whatever we want and not think about who's around us or who's going to use it with us or who's going to use it after us. The Pope's encyclical is just one big sort of act of gratitude. Let's be grateful for this gift God gave us that provides us food, provides us a home, provides us recreation and joy, and even can provide us a connection to Him as we enjoy it.
It's my pleasure to introduce Emily Zanon. Emily Zanon is a watershed project manager for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Watershed Division. In her role at MPCA, she is responsible for coordinating water quality projects and drafting watershed reports in 9 watersheds throughout southeast Minnesota. These projects and reports help us understand watershed conditions, where to prioritize water quality work, and strategies for meeting water quality goals. She recently celebrated her 4th year as a watershed project manager for MPCA, but has been in the water quality sector for 15 years. Emily received a BA in environmental biology from St. Mary's University in Winona. And after graduating, she moved to Salt Lake City, where she spent 7 years monitoring water quality and regulating stormwater for Utah's Division of Environmental Quality. When she returned to Minnesota, she held positions with the DNR in the Aquatic Plant Management Program and with Winona County as a county feedlot officer. Please join me in welcoming Emily.
Thank you, Isaac, and good morning, everybody. Good to see some new faces this morning, and hello to everyone that's joining us via Zoom. And Isaac, thanks for that really nice introduction. As you mentioned, I'm just going to talk all about our water quality this morning, and I'm really going to focus in on our surface water. And what I mean by surface water is our rivers, lakes, and our streams. So my presentation is called The Water Quality Around You. So I'll wait for Isaac to get my slides loaded. Perfect. That's okay, take your time. So before we get started, how many of you that are in person today, how many of you are joining from west of I-35? How many of you live west of I-35? Okay. How many of you live east of I-35? Okay, so we have a lot of eastern Minnesota folks here. Well, my hometown is Alberta, Minnesota, so I'm smack dab on I-35 pretty much. But my husband and I live in Pullman, Wisconsin, so it was fun to drive I-90 to Owatonna this morning.
All here view.
Slideshow. Slideshow.
There we go.
Perfect, thanks, Isaac. Right, go to the next slide. So I thought I'd just share a couple pictures of me doing my favorite things. And one of my favorite things is fishing. I love being outside. I'm an avid hunter. I enjoy fishing, hiking, gardening, anything outside. It's kind of why I'm in this line of work. I really enjoy being outside. My husband and I also run a really small hobby farm where we raise chickens for meat and eggs. We also experimented with sheep this year, and I think we will try to get next year, but we'll see how the market goes. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. Okay, so here's the roadmap for my presentation this morning. I'm going to start out by talking about something a little dry, but still really important, and that's the different state agencies that we have in Minnesota that deal with water. And then I'll be getting into the good stuff. We'll talk about what does water quality look like in greater southern Minnesota. I'll talk about 4 pollutants that cause a lot of issues. And then we'll round the corner and talk about how we all can improve our water and what we need for the future. All right, well, we all live in Minnesota. It has a special place in our heart, right? And we know that the state of Minnesota is special, not just because of our home, but because of these 3 things here. And this is kind of special because of a certain water quality aspect, okay? So the state of Minnesota is really diverse when we think about our landscape and our ecosystems. I mean, here in Owatonna, if you were to go outside, it'd be like pretty much flat landscape, rolling hills. But if we drive 5 hours north, it's gonna look totally different, right? A lot of pine forest, not as many people, and that really can impact the quality of our water, just the landscape. Another thing that makes Minnesota special when it comes to water quality is that we have an aquatic life standard. So all of our water quality standards are written into law. And Minnesota is special in that it has a rule, a water quality standard for fish and bugs. Okay, not every state in the United States has that, so I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But just remember, we have a fish and bug standard. The last thing that makes Minnesota special is funding. Whenever I talk to my counterparts in Utah or different parts of the state, they say, oh my gosh, you guys in Minnesota, you're so lucky. You have this Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. Maybe some of you have seen this logo in some of our state publications. But what this is, back in 2008, we all, as citizens of Minnesota, voted on this amendment. And what that did is it took a portion of all sales tax and put it in this fund. So we have this Clean Water Fund, we have Arts and Humanities, we've got wildlife habitat. So that's where a lot of my work gets funded through that fund. So those are the 3 special things that make Minnesota special, besides what we already know. Okay, so now let's talk about state agencies that we have. So I'm going to talk about 5 agencies, but I'm lumping 4 of them together. And some of these are going to be pretty familiar to you. DNR, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Agriculture, NPCA, Pollution Control Agency, and then the Department of Health. So I lump those 4 together because they're all the same in that they have a regulatory branch and a research branch, okay? So we have people that write permits, that do enforcement, and then we also have scientists that do research out in the field. So Department of Natural Resources, DNR, their focus is game, fish, and wildlife, right? Department of Ag, they're looking at how our agriculture can impact our environment. And PCA, we're kind of doing the same thing. We want to see how our actions impact the environment, but we're also the agency that is responsible for figuring out the quality of our water in the state. And then Department of Health, they're responsible for our drinking water. So we all kind of have like different responsibilities when it comes to water. We work really well together, but we all kind of have different jurisdictions, okay? At least our different focuses of water. And then I have our friends at BWSR, Bowser, that's how you say that acronym. That stands for the Board of Water and Soil Resources. And I put them in the corner by themselves because they're a little different. They don't have a regulatory branch and a research branch. Their one purpose is implementation, which is a fancy word for saying doing stuff on the landscape to improve the environment. Okay? So we look to Bowser to help us do things on the landscape to make improvements. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the NPCA, Pollution Control Agency. I said that we're the agency that's responsible for figuring out how our waters are doing, right? And so we do that by going out in the field, pulling samples, collecting data, and then bringing that data back into our office and comparing it to 4 categories of water quality standards. And this is what those are. We have our aquatic consumption. Can we eat the fish that live in the water? So that's where our mercury and our PCB standards live. If you get like the fish eating guidelines from DNR, the mercury consumption, how many meals of fish from this water can I eat per month? That's where that information comes from. Okay. We have an aquatic recreation standard. Can I swim, play, wade in the water without getting sick? This is where our E. coli bacteria and our lake eutrophication standard live. I'll talk about eutrophication here in a little bit. We have our aquatic life standard, that special fish and bug standard. This basically says, do we have healthy fish and bugs? So think about this. Every water in the state, for the most part, has a fish and a bug standard. So if I'm going to go up to the boundary waters of Minnesota, in my mind, I'm thinking about that water. It's cold, not a lot of development. You expect to see certain fish and bugs there, right? So that would be the standard for the boundary waters. Now, if I'm going down to Fountain Lake in Albert Lea, should I expect the fish and the bugs to be in Fountain Lake the same as would be up in the boundary waters? No, totally different water, right? So we don't have the same fish and bug standard across the entire state. It's like eco-region specific, right? Depending on the kind of water, we expect to see kinds of fish and bugs. The last category of water quality standard we have is a drinking water or groundwater standard. This is special for cold waters that basically have groundwater inputs. And we want to make sure that that water is safe from nitrates and non-agriculture chemicals. All right. Minnesota is the land of how many lakes? 10,000. Yes, there is a lot of water in the state of Minnesota. And we're only one agency. We have maybe 20, 25 staff that are responsible for going out in the field every year collecting water. So it's not practical for us to get every single water in the entire state of Minnesota, right? So what we did is we divided the state up into 80 major watersheds. So this map, for those of you in the back, you don't see the typical county boundaries. Instead, you see watershed boundaries. So a watershed is basically just any area of land that water drains to in a specific point. So here in Owatonna, we're in the Lesueur River watershed. So all the water here, if you're a raindrop, you will eventually find your way into the Lesueur River. So we're in the Lesueur River watershed. Okay. So we're organized into 80 watersheds, and what we do is every 10 years, MPCA staff go out in the field and visit a watershed. We spend 2 years out in the field sampling for water samples. We'll go to a local stream, dip a bottle, send that to a lab. We'll sample for fish and we sample for bugs. Oops, sorry. So I mentioned that it takes us, each watershed is on a 10-year cycle. So we sample for 2 years. Year number 3, we take all that data, look at it, figure out what waters are doing okay, figure out which waters aren't doing so okay, and we spend those years in that watershed cycle figuring out what we're going to do to improve those waters or protect waters that are looking good. And then after 10 years, we revisit again. So that's kind of how we do that. Sorry, go one more slide ahead. So biological monitoring, there were some pictures of some fish and bugs.
One more slide ahead?
Yeah, go, sorry, I was going.
Oh, back.
Go back a little bit. So biological monitoring, this is monitoring for fish and bugs. And I think this is one of the more interesting parts of our work, because who doesn't love, working with fish and bugs? So this is a picture on the bottom of our fish shocking cruise. Has anyone ever seen or heard of fish shocking? Okay, we have a couple people that know what that is, yeah. So essentially, this is what we do when we collect fish. We're not like out there with a pole trying to figure out how many fish are there. No, we take backpacks that are set up with a battery, and we essentially put electricity into the stream. Okay, and what that does is that temporarily stuns or shocks the fish, so we can easily net them, identify them, get a length and weight, figure out what kind of fish are out there. So it's a pretty neat thing. Okay, now we're ready for the next slide. Thanks. So I didn't mention this in the beginning, but I love interacting with people during my presentations, and so I sprinkled in some fun things to kind of think a little bit about the information that I'm presenting. So here's our first trivia question. Now there isn't I'm not keeping score, there are no prizes, but you just get the satisfaction of knowing that you were right if you get this correct. So the first question is, what is a watershed? Is it A, a spray that makes your clothes waterproof, B, an area of land that water drains to a specific point, C, a building used to store water, or D, a dried up lake basin? What do you think a watershed is? B, yes, an area of land that water drains to. Okay, so in southern Minnesota, all the way from Rock County to Houston County, we have 15 watersheds. So this picture is just a snip of a map. You see like the gray county boundaries, but then that blue line are those watershed boundaries. And all of the water in southern Minnesota eventually ends up at the Gulf of Mexico. But depending on where you are in southern Minnesota, you might take a different route. So if you're in far western Minnesota in Rock and Nobles County, you go to the Missouri River first before joining the Mississippi, way down there. If you're in Jackson and Martin County, you end up to the Gulf via Des Moines River. Faribault, Freeport, Malheur, we float in the Cedar River for a little bit before meeting up with the Mississippi. And far eastern Minnesota in Malheur, Fillmore, and Houston, we drain to the upper Mississippi River and take a long float down to the Gulf. So let's talk a little bit more about these 15, sorry, yes, you have a question?
Yeah, you talked about a 10-year cycle.
Yes.
Now, if there are 15 watersheds, usually 15 watersheds in the southeast
Yes.
area.
Yes.
So which one of these going to take 10-year span?
Yes, and we do more than one watershed in a year. So we'll do like 5 or 6 watersheds every year. But it takes, once we start in a watershed, so for example, if we sampled around Owatonna this year and next year, we wouldn't come back until 2032 and 2033. So we wait 10 years before sampling again, which is a long time.
I was gonna say, how much of a difference do you see in that time?
Right, right. So it's a long time that the state does it. Now, there's local folks that sample more frequently that work for the soil and water or for the county. They can sample more frequently, but this at the state level, we only have so many resources. So that's what we're able to do. Good question. Okay, so more about these 15 watersheds in southern Minnesota. We have some similarities and some differences, okay? As far as being the same, our landscape is about the same, right? We're mostly farmland, we're mostly rural in nature, no major really big cities. And most of our waters are warm water, which means we don't have a lot of trout water except in southeastern Minnesota, which Jeff will get into. Some differences. Western Minnesota is a lot drier, on average about 10 inches drier than eastern Minnesota. There's a lot more lakes in south central Minnesota because of the prairie pothole region. In southeastern Minnesota, that driftless area has a really leaky geology called karst, which Jeff might get into a little bit. And that can be good and bad. That's one of the reasons why we have such good cold trout waters, because we have groundwater interaction with other surface water. So the number one question I get, how's our water? Well, this is a snip of map of those 15 watersheds. So just to kind of help read this map, those thick blue lines are watershed boundaries, okay? These red lines are streams that aren't doing that great. They are impaired. They're not meeting a water quality standard. Streams that are labeled in yellow mean that we don't have enough information to make a decision yet. We need to go back in the field and collect more information. And then the streams that are in light blue are meeting their water quality standards, so they're looking good. So if you look, there's a lot of red up there, right? The number one reason why our streams are impaired is because the fish and the bugs aren't looking that great. And most of the time it's the bugs. The second reason we have impaired waters is because of bacteria, E. coli. And the number 3 reason why we have impairments is because of nitrate. This picture just shows streams, but there also are lakes in our watershed. 62 of those are impaired for nutrients. And so that kind of brings me to the next section of my presentation, these 4 common pollutants: bacteria, sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So we'll move on to talking about these 4 common pollutants. But any questions before we kind of transition a little bit about watersheds or the work that MPCA does? All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with kind of an easy one. And that's E. coli bacteria. E. coli bacteria comes from human and animal waste. So if there's cattle grazing or loafing in the stream, they're doing all their business there, and E. coli bacteria can be present. Humans, if we have leaky septic systems, that can be a potential source for E. coli bacteria. And if you're a farmer who raises livestock and you have to spread manure, that manure in the wrong spot can get into our water, and that can be a source of E. coli. So the interesting thing about E. coli is that it's an indicator organism, which means that MPCA uses it to figure out, do we have harmful organisms called pathogens in our water? So just because a river or stream is impaired for E. coli doesn't mean that if I dip my toe in that water, I'm going to get sick. Okay? It just means that if you have a lot of E. coli, you also have a greater chance of there being pathogens in the water. And because of COVID-19, you might have heard of the word pathogen. It's just an organism that causes human health issues. So the pathogens that we're most worried about are Giardia and Cryptosporidium. If you've ever been to a pool that's been closed because of Cryptosporidium, it might have been because there were a lot of infants swimming with their diapers on. Just kind of, not fun to think about, but. And Giardia can be anywhere. You could be in a high mountain stream in the middle of Wyoming, drink water untreated, and get sick because Giardia is there. So we use E. coli to be kind of a screen for those pathogens. Doesn't necessarily mean they're there, but the chances are greater. So go back one more slide, and I'm going to talk about bacteria solutions, because sources of bacteria are kind of obvious. So here's some things we can do to fix bacteria. If you have a septic system, just make sure that you're checking it on a regular basis, getting it inspected to make sure that it's not leaking. This gentleman has a wetland in the back, it looks like. So it's important that he's making sure his septic is working. Manure is very heavily regulated in the state of Minnesota. You just can't be pretty willy-nilly with it. So if you are spreading manure and it leaves your field and enters the surface water, you can get into some major trouble. And then as far as livestock grazing a stream, this is another question that I get. Isn't that illegal? Isn't it illegal to have cattle grazing or loafing around in the stream? No, that is not illegal. That is a perfectly legal thing for farmers to do. But we say that's not always the best thing for the water, right? So we recommend that they do things like livestock restriction, like putting fencing in, so the cattle can come in, get a drink, but not do all of their business. All right, I'm moving on to sediment, but are there any questions on bacteria before I move on to sediment? All right, sediment, dirt. This is the pollutant that's responsible for most of those fish and bug impairments that we have. Sediment comes from the ground, right? When it rains, if there's exposed dirt, that can be carried through our rainwater. But sediment also comes from stream banks or lake shore itself. Imagine if this stream was flowing really heavily, it scours that stream bank and then that falls into the creek. So that's another source of sediment. Sediment is really dangerous because it causes cloudy water. Look at that picture in the lower right, that tributary, that stream is flowing into the rather crystal clear one there. And that water is so cloudy because of all that sediment that's in there. And imagine being a fish or a bug living in that really cloudy water. You can't see your food, you can't see your home, your gills get clogged up. It just makes it really difficult. And this is a picture of our equipment that we deployed in a stream over a long period of time, probably 2 or 3 weeks. There was so much sediment that settled out and clogged all of our equipment up. So it's a pretty dangerous pollutant. But we have a lot of options when it comes to fixing sediment from getting into our water. And if you can see these pictures, you might have or find a common theme. What's something that you see in all 5 of these pictures? Plants. Yes, plants. Such a simple thing, plants. But they have roots, and those roots keep that dirt in place. Okay, so the more plants we use, the less sediment that we have. So some practices that I'm showing here on this slide, if you look on the upper left, this really isn't plants per se, but we use woody debris and we anchor it against the stream bank so that when that water gets really fast, it won't eat away at the stream bank. Instead, it'll hit that wood first. So that's a really cool tool that we see. Cover crops, farmers planting cover crops in between their corn and soybeans. More roots on the ground help keep that dirt in place. Buffers are a great option because they help trap any dirt that comes out of farm fields. And if you're in Mower County or close to Mower County, this picture on the lower right is something called a prairie strip. And this is a new practice, and Mower County is really doing a lot of these, but farmers are planting strips of prairie in their corn and soybean fields, and they stay there forever. So it's just little sections of prairie in their farm fields, and those can be great at trapping sediment too. Any questions on sediment? Yeah.
What's the buffer zone?
The buffer zone, I believe it's like 30, like it has to at least be a minimum of like 34 feet, I think it is.
I thought it was 50, that's why I was.
Yeah, everyone remembers 50. I think it has to have an average of 50 with a minimum of 34, 35. Yeah. So you'll see sometimes they're not always perfectly like square against a stream. But yeah, I think the counties are now responsible for double checking buffer widths, but that's why they're so important. They help trap sediment. So the wider that buffer is, the better it's gonna be.
This is kind of a strange question, but is there a difference? I mean, can you describe the difference between dirt and soil?
That's like a philosophical question, the difference between dirt and soil. Because you think soil sounds better than dirt, but they're the same thing. Same thing, yeah.
Because I've seen it differentiated.
Sure.
According to the nutrients that involve, so there can be dirt that has no value as far as growing things, and there's soil.
Sure.
And one can be enriched to become. That's what that's.
Sure. No, that's a great statement. Glad you brought that up. Yep. But I use them interchangeably. Yeah. Thank you. All right, now we're going to talk about the third out of the 4 pollutants that are responsible for our impairments. And this next one is nitrate. So where does nitrate come from? Well, nitrate comes from nitrogen, right? But when I'm talking about nitrogen, I'm not talking about the elements on the periodic table. I'm talking mostly about commercial fertilizer, okay, like urea. But nitrate can also come from nitrogen sources that are in animal manure and human waste. And nitrate happens when these forms of nitrogen get converted into nitrate. Okay? So we're not putting on nitrate, we're putting on nitrogen, but then it turns into nitrate. So what's the big deal about nitrate? Why is it bad? Well, it has some human health and some environmental consequences. Once in nitrate, okay, once nitrogen gets turned into nitrate, it bonds really tightly with water. So it gets into our water and then it moves really easily wherever water goes. So let's say I put nitrogen on my farm field, it turns into nitrate, and then it rains. That rainwater carries nitrate down to our groundwater, and now I have nitrate in my groundwater. And then I start drinking that water. If I'm drinking a lot of water with nitrate in it, nitrate basically blocks your blood from absorbing oxygen. If you have no oxygen, you can't breathe. If you can't breathe, it's not good, right? That's why you may have heard of blue baby syndrome. Infants have been drinking water with high levels of nitrate in them. They are blue because they're suffocating. Okay? So it's awful. It's very awful. But nitrate, besides human health impacts, also impacts bugs. Bugs are very sensitive to nitrate. So you could have a beautiful stream, a cold water stream, that has high levels of nitrate in it. You won't see the bugs like the mayflies and the stoneflies and the caddis fly. The last thing I want to talk about with nitrate is the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Any of you guys heard about this in the news? Sometimes it pops up. But it's this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico where it's totally absent of life. There's no fish, there's no bugs, there's no plants, and part of that is because there's too much nitrate coming in from all the waters that drain to the Gulf. Okay, well, not everyone in southern Minnesota might think of nitrate as like their top health concern when it comes to their water. Why is that? Well, these pictures are kind of explaining that. All has to do with geology. And I'm going to try to just hit this at like a very high level because Jeff's going to get into this following me. But basically what it comes down to is how much dirt, soil, glacial till is the fancy word for it, that's underneath our land surface. So if you're in Owatonna, western Minnesota, you have a lot of soil and sand underneath your land. And that acts as a filter. It can filter out that nitrate before it gets into your groundwater aquifer. Okay, so that's why nitrate, if you have a lot of this glacial till above your groundwater, you're not super concerned about it. But in southeastern Minnesota, we don't have that buffer of that glacial till, that soil. You put nitrate or nitrogen on the landscape, you go maybe a couple feet in some areas, bam, you're at the groundwater aquifer. There's no filter. So that's why, particularly in southeastern Minnesota, nitrate is a huge concern for us. So because the agricultural community is unfortunately the #1 source of nitrogen because of the commercial fertilizer they use, they're the group that we work with the most to encourage them to think about maybe using nitrogen a little differently. We ask them to use the right kind of fertilizer, putting on only the amount their crops need so that there's not a lot left on the landscape, putting that nitrogen fertilizer on at the right time and on the right place. But they also have these products, Instinct and NSERV, they can add to their fertilizer. And that prevents their nitrogen from turning into nitrate, keeps it in nitrogen. So that's kind of a helpful product. It's very expensive though, so it'll take time for it to develop and be a little bit cheaper. The last practice that we recommend are cover crops, because the more plants that you have growing year round, the more nitrogen that those plants will uptake. Okay. So any questions on nitrate before I move on to the final pollutants? Yeah. Yes. Ammonium is a type of nitrogen. Yep. But it has to go through a lot of different processes to turn into nitrate, right, Jeff? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is nitrogen, if it doesn't turn into nitrate, harmful in any way in excess amounts?
It asphyxiates you in the first place, displace air. It's too much. It's 70% of our air already. But it's a complicated nitrogen cycle that's based on oxidation. So nitrate is totally oxidized. Nitric acid is not. Ammonia is not in the absence of nitrogen. So depending on its environment, the earth, but to mammals in particular, nitrate is acid.
That was a good question. Yeah. Yeah.
We found through research, ag research, that we could get by with a lot less nitrogen than we used to. Rather than basically use it on corn. And so we use the nitrogen inhibitors like Instinct before. And also we use a lot less, which is great because nitrogen now is very expensive. And so we can get by with less nitrogen. But the problem this area, it's hard to justify, like they got grass growing between the rows. That can run like maybe $50 an acre to do, and because of we're harvesting in the fall, and we don't have enough time to seed that in the fall and get enough growth. If we do get seeded enough growth, that it doesn't do much in the spring before we're planting corn or soybeans in that.
Right.
And so that's the So we're in a very pothole, so the rain comes so fast, and so much at a time, that it fills up these potholes. And that's where the nitrogen is accumulated, and then it goes down through the tiles and into the streams. So that's another big problem we face. And years and years ago, most farms started with a shallow well. Well, you can't have a shallow well on a farm anymore because it's loaded with nitrate, so everybody have to dig a deep well that goes down hundreds of feet. So then we have, as I said before, we have all this water coming in a short period of time, so we have to run. And then this more runoff we have, we lose more nitrates into the atmosphere, which increases the global warming, which comes back, and we have more severe storms and high density rainfalls.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a really conundrum we face here, is how are we going to control it? We have to control it.
Right.
We can't, and we could space our nitrogen applications, maybe some at planting and then some before the corn gets too high where you can't get into it anymore. But then, because of high rainfall sometimes, then we can't put on the rest of the nitrogen, so then we have to go into the high boy, and then they put it on top of the soil near the corn plant, but then you need rainfall to suck that into the ground.
Right.
And so we're just facing a lot of problems that we want to solve, but how do we do it?
I know. It is. It's very challenging and it's overwhelming. I mean, you can go down that rabbit hole and just feel so overwhelmed with what are we going to do? And that's why we just kind of have to take it one thing at a time, right? Try just a little something different on small acres of land and see if that works for your operation, and just kind of take baby steps. But yeah, farming it's complex, and nitrogen itself is complex. So we just kind of have to get used to taking baby steps and changing course when we need to. Yeah.
I realize that your topic is mainly surface waters, but in southeast Minnesota, with the karst formations of and I've always had the impression that when nitrates are high, we also have high levels of agricultural. And some of these are different structures. They are extremely harmful.
Yeah.
And we don't test for them. We don't know what we do. Yeah, I would like to see they tell us more about what these other chemicals are, because it's not. Therefore, so what are we drinking?
Right. No, that's a very, very good statement. She was saying that there's a lot more than just nitrate that can get into our waters in these agricultural settings, harmful endocrine disruptors from agricultural products and that sort of thing. And there are lots of sampling wells that we have throughout the entire state of Minnesota. Department of Agriculture has some, and NPCA and DNR. We all have groundwater wells that sample. But I think we need more of them. So that is something that we can advocate for, more groundwater drinking wells, to figure out what's going on. What do we have in our groundwater? It's a great statement. Yeah, I'll take one more and then we'll move on.
I just had a quick question. I'm not a farmer, so a lot of this stuff is definitely over my head. But is there a way of fixing what's already been broken as far as does it eventually heal? Like that dead zone that you talk about down in the Gulf, is that something that eventually will heal? Or
Yeah, the question was, have we gone too far? Are we basically at a point of no return? Are we going to see recovery in our lifetime? We don't know. I think we're all hopeful, yes, we will. But these things take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, so we really have to be patient. So some things like sediment, fixing sediment, those are things we can see pretty quick fixes with, right? Things like nitrate, things like with contamination in our groundwater, those can take years, if not decades or centuries to fix. So, yeah, good question. All right, well, let's round the corner and talk about phosphorus and how it can cause lake eutrophication. So eutrophication means too much nutrients, nutrient rich. So how many of you have a local water body in southern Minnesota and you've seen a lake that looks like pea soup? I know, we all have. I remember growing up in Alberta, I used to be on the water ski team, and there would be times we couldn't practice because there was a blue-green algae bloom, which is great because it leads into Applebee's, but not great for the water quality, right? So phosphorus is what's causing that lake eutrophication. So where does phosphorus come from? I put 3 pictures that kind of describe the big sources of phosphorus. This one on the bottom in the center is a picture of a quaint little house on nice lakeshore property. Yikes! It's not going to be there very much longer, is it? That's a really scary picture. But that lakeshore is being eaten away by the wave action, and so that lakeshore, it's the soil, the dirt itself has phosphorus in it. So anytime you're getting soil into a water body, that's phosphorus. But I also have a picture of a storm drain. All of the storm drains that we have in the state drain the water. A lake, a stream, a river. So if there's grass clippings, if there's leaves, all that organic matter is full of phosphorus, so that can get into our waters. But then we have this thing called internal phosphorus load. This is specific to lakes. A lake itself has phosphorus in it. So we have, fish and bugs and phytoplankton in the water column. They're living their best life. The life cycle happens, they settle to the bottom. And that's where the source of phosphorus in the lake that's on the bottom. And as long as there's lots of oxygen in the lake, that phosphorus gets metabolized by bacteria. It stays in check, okay? But the minute there isn't any oxygen in that lake, the phosphorus in the bottom will get released from the lake bottom and get introduced back into the water. So algae can eat it up and bloom. So think basically, no oxygen in a lake means more phosphorus. So here's what we do to fix eutrophication. We recommend that people have nice, beautiful native lakeshore because those plant roots keep that soil in place. Those plants also absorb phosphorus that might be near that lakeshore. A lot of cities are using these storm drain filters that catch the leaves and the grass clippings from getting into the water that it drains to. And then that internal load of phosphorus in our lakes, what do we do about that? Well, if you've ever noticed like a beautiful fountain or maybe an aerator on your lake, that's what the purpose is to keep that oxygen in the lake so that phosphorus on the bottom doesn't release. But then we also have things like alum treatments. Maybe some of you have heard of that. Alum is an aluminum solution, and it just bonds to the phosphorus that's in that water column. So it prevents it from being able to be released in the water. Okay, so that's phosphorus. Any questions before our second trivia question about phosphorus? Okay, well, this trivia question is kind of related. Eutrophication describes what water condition? Is it A, too much phosphorus fueling algae? B, too many boaters restricting swimming? C, temperature creates a layer in the water column? Or D, female sheep, known as ewes, are grazing on the shoreline? What's eutrophication? Yes, A, very good. All right, so I'm just gonna spend the last 5 minutes, we're still good at 5 minutes, okay, talking about where we go from here, now that we know what our issues are. Okay, my job as a project manager is to write these watershed reports. What these watershed reports do are they describe the condition of these watersheds that we have in southern Minnesota. And then what are our water quality goals? You know, we have these waters that look great, so our goal should be to protect these waters. But then these waters over here don't look so good. So what can we do to fix those? So I basically talk with people like you, local folks. I talk with soil and water staff. I talk with county staff. And I say, what works well in this area to meet these goals? So we essentially write like a prescription for the waters. And then we hope that then those people read this report, get those ideas, and make those changes on the landscape to make a water quality improvement. Hey, remember when I talked about my friends at Bowser, the Board of Soil and Water? They're the ones that are all about implementation, right? Putting action onto the land. Well, they have a program called One Watershed, One Plan. Almost all of our watersheds in southern Minnesota are in this plan or are planning on being on this plan. What this is it's basically a plan that's funded by the state to help people get together and talk about what they're going to do on the landscape to make their water quality improvements. It's essentially taking part of my report and saying, well, what kind of things are going to work here? And then writing a plan to say, okay, well, we're going to do, you know, cover crops in year 2023 over here. We're going to, you know, plant, you know, plants over here. Or we're going to clean out our storm drains over here. It's just a plan for improving our water quality. The great thing about One Watershed One Plan is it comes with money from that Clean Water Fund. And there's also state partners like myself that kind of help the local people write the plan because it's locally driven. It's the people at the county, the city level that write this plan. Okay. So are we meeting our goals for the state of Minnesota? We have a statewide goal of reducing our phosphorus and our nitrogen by 45% by the year 2040. That's our state goal. Well, when it comes to phosphorus, we're just over halfway there. We've seen almost about a 30% reduction of phosphorus in the state of Minnesota, which is great. It's a huge success story. And most of that work is being done because we're putting phosphorus limits on our wastewater treatment plants, but we still have a little ways to go for phosphorus. When it comes to nitrogen, unfortunately, we are missing the mark. We have a lot more work to do on phosphorus, or excuse me, on nitrogen. And most importantly, we need to focus on non-point source. Non-point source is basically anything that's not a pipe, like a factory or a treatment plant. That's a point source because you can actually go to a specific point and say that's where the pollution is coming from. But out on the landscape, it's not like that, right? And non-point sources are for the most part not regulated. So we rely on people to do these things out of the goodness of their hearts. That can be a little difficult. So this is what I think we need for the future. We need vocal citizen advocates. People like Jeff, people like you all. We need you to advocate for our water. Because I can go on and on and on and on and on as a state employee. And you know, it's difficult when you hear the same message from the same person. The second one is really, really important to me. Bold, local government action. Things at the state aren't quick all the time, are they? But at a local level, at the city council, at the county board level, they can be much faster. So if you want to see a change in your local water, I think that's the best place to start. So get involved in your local government. I think continued support of that Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, that sales tax, is going to be really important for the future of our water because that fund helps us do this work. And lastly, we need to continue and get better at working together, both in the public sector and the private sector. Yes.
What is the 2034?
The 2034, yes, this is the year I have on my calendar. This is the year that that Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment is going to be back up to be voted on by the citizens. So we're all kind of going to be interested to see what happens there. Good question. Okay. So water quality is everybody's responsibility, right? We can all do something regardless of our age, regardless of our ability to improve and protect water. Citizen monitoring is one thing you can do. NPCA has a website where you can be a citizen monitor. You sign up and you measure how clear or dirty the water is. It's really easy and it's really fun. So get in touch with me if that's something you want to do. Host a stream or a lake cleanup. Get involved in your local governments. And know your local waters. This is something that might be kind of like hippy-dippy, but this is what I mean by getting to know your local waters. How many times are you driving home or cruising to the grocery store and you drive over a stream or river or right next to a lake and you don't even think about it? Well, the next time you're doing that, just stop for 5 minutes and roll down your windows. In a safe spot, of course, right? But just like listen. Listen to the birds and the bugs and the frogs. And notice how it makes you feel. In the beginning of our presentations together, we were just talking about how healing nature is. And it's so true, right? Water is so important to us. So just get to know your local water. And the more you know it, the more you will care for that. Okay, one last question on trivia. What actions can we all do to protect and improve water? A, organize a stream cleanup. B, attend a local council meeting. C, be a water advocate. D, learn the water near you. Or E, all of these. Yes, E, all of these. So you were 3 for 3. Excellent job. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you so much. And any other questions I'd like to answer?
For 4 years over in Waseca, I was lake monitor for Loon Lake and dropped a second dish down. The first year, the clarity of the water was 9 inches. By the 4th year, they had improved things to almost 3 feet.
Wow.
But at the beginning of the spring, it was all the way down to the bottom, 8 feet.
Wow.
And I'm wondering, what did the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency do with that information when I sent in that information about water clarity?
Yeah, so Father Life asked a great question. He's a volunteer monitor, or was for Loon Lake. So he measured the transparency or how clear the lake water was. So what happens with that information that he collected out in the field? So what we do is we take volunteer information like that you collect, and we actually use it when we're determining whether waters are meeting or not meeting the standard. And in a situation kind of like Loon Lake, it was a stream in southeastern Minnesota. We had over 30 years of transparency data that someone would now be collected, and that was the determining factor on figuring out if that water was doing good or bad. So it's very useful to us. We find it very important and valuable. So it's used to basically help make the decision: is the water meeting the standard or not meeting the standard? Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, a lot of us worked hard to get this clean water land and legacy as a law. So it's funded every year. And with the help of the wildlife people, it's how we got it passed. The thing is, there are legislators that do not like that. They may have they may not like the FDCA. And so they're always trying to, well, maybe we could get some funds from that legacy, you know what I mean? And so we've got to always be alert to that and make sure that our legislators know that we, the people out here, want that continue, because I mean, this is for our own protection as God's stewards of this planet. We've got to be stewards. So,
and I love that you're thinking not just 2 years or 5 years, but 12 years ahead.
Yeah, we try. Yes, thank you. Yeah, question in the back.
No, you did agree that you need more testing of agrochemicals. Where would the funding come from? Funding to do the more research like that?
Yeah, so when we're talking about agriculture chemicals, that would be the Department of Agriculture. That's the agency that does that work. PCA is more focused on non-agricultural chemicals like PFAS or PFAS. You've heard of that. But the funding to do that work, regardless if it's from the Department of Agriculture or NPCA, comes from that Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. We can also apply for, like, if it's a local, like a county or a city that wants to drill a monitoring well, they could maybe apply for a grant from EPA or from a different organization that has grants for funding. So that's where that money comes from. Good question. Does that make sense? Okay. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for being so engaging. I know we're a little over, but I appreciate the conversation. And I'll turn it back over to Isaac.
Thank you, Emily. That was very good, very informational. And we're going to just take a brief bathroom and coffee break. It's listed as 15 minutes, it was originally, but we're going to try to stick to 10 minutes. So we'll get started with our second talk at 11:35. So. All right, we're back at it. So we're ready to start our second presentation. My pleasure to introduce Jeff Broberg. Jeff is a Minnesota licensed professional geologist who lives on Dakota land on his 170-acre farm in western Winona County. He graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1977 and went to work in the oil industry of South Louisiana until 1986, when he moved back home to Minnesota. Jeff helped start an environmental consulting firm in Rochester in 1991, where he consulted with private clients on environmental risk management. He retired in 2018 and, wanting to start an encore career in the nonprofit sector, working on environmental issues, he returned to college, and in 2019, he earned a master's degree in philanthropy and development at St. Mary's University of Minnesota. We got a lot of SMU alumni here, including myself. So he is one of the founders of the Minnesota Well Owners Organization, or MINWO, a group advocating for private well owners. MINWO's focus is on ensuring that every Minnesota well owner has safe water at their kitchen sink. His organization holds free water testing clinics and advises well owners across the state. Please join me in welcoming Jeff. Yep.
Thank you very much, everybody, for having me today. I'm delighted to be here, and we'll go through the slides and see if we can make this work in a seamless fashion. You heard the story that I retired in 2018, and when I went back to school, I started looking for people that were working in culture and spirituality about water. I was today's years old before I've been asked to speak on that subject. So I really feel blessed. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in this. It's an important subject that I hope we can shed some light on. So next slide. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and some of my water milestones. I guess I started fishing when I was about 5 years old, 1958. And I've been connected to the water through angling as part of my cultural history, and it's been an important part of my life. The University of Minnesota, graduated there in 1977, and I went to work in the oil business during the second oil crisis. There for 10 years, I have guilt. That's what I know now. Things that I did then were destructive, and we didn't even talk about global warming or the impacts of hydrocarbons. It wasn't on the radar, but I had a great job during a recession when everybody else was broke because of the price of oil. But I learned an industry and learned some important principles. When I left that industry, it had collapsed. The price of oil had gone from almost $100 a barrel to $11. The town I lived in, it had 800 geologists, and it was lines, literally, of U-Haul trailers when school left the year the oil price crashed. And I took my wife's hobby, which is raising horses, and moved back to Minnesota. We bought a farm up on Dakota land, north of St. Charles, raised racehorses. We brought 25 thoroughbred racehorses with us November Thanksgiving weekend. They 1986. We went broke doing that. I still love horses, and we had horses until just 2 years ago. I had a good job, and I became a landfill gas inspector and superintendent. So I worked on landfills all over the country trying to recover gas emissions. I started getting more interested in renewable energy and in the things that were non-petroleum energy. And started, I was welcome to join an engineering consulting firm in 1991, Ian Betts, Rochester. And I was invited to start an environmental division for them. It was at a time when risk management for environmental things had finally come to the fore, and financing in particular of properties because of liability. But I had a passion, and I learned of the Minnesota Trout Association, a group that was focused, it was different than Trout Unlimited, focused on cold water trout resources, coming after trout fishing. And I learned an important lesson there from my mentor, Mel Hogsted, a retired fisheries manager, who said, if you love this stuff, you have to get involved in the policy and funding at the state level. So I really dug in, and I was invited to be part of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Budget Oversight Committee, which I sat on that for 10 years. We would go through all the spreadsheets of where the money came from, 26 different sources of funding, 70 different ways to spend it. But it was a real education that brought me to be appointed to the Minnesota Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, the LCCMR. That's the group that gives away the lottery money, recommends giving away the lottery money. And I've been involved in that level of politics ever since. Retired in 2018 after I sold my company, and I became a founding director of Midwood. And went back to school to St. Mary's for probably one of the most useful experiences of my life, because I was taught so many things. As a scientist, I thought that facts matter. And it's much more than that. What people believe matters. And it was the gap that I was missing in all of my work as a scientist. So next slide. So science taught me a lot, no doubt about it. I mean, taught me doubt everything not supported by the facts. You have to have questions, you have to prove it, it has to be reproducible. Facts matter. It also told me some things that maybe aren't so good. The right of discovery is an important principle. It's a principle in the church, even in discovery of new continents were appropriated. But the right of discovery taught us that if we discovered a fact, it was kind of ours to own. That doesn't help spread the word or make it useful. So I go back to one of the people that I really looked for in my education, Richard Feynman. And I'll read it. Scientists has a lot of experience with ignorance and doubt and uncertainty, and this experience is of great importance, I think. When a scientist doesn't know the answer to a problem, he's ignorant. When he has a hunch as to what the result is, he's uncertain. And when he's pretty damn sure of what the result's going to be, he still has some doubt. Scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty. Some more unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. This drives science, but it doesn't help us always. To be certain in the face of probability and ignore the probabilities of harm is something that we ignore in science too often. So I learned when I came out of college, went to work in the oil business, and it was all about managing risk. They hired us to tell the geologists to tell where to drill. It was at a time when they just invented blowout preventers. Remember the Deepwater Horizon blowout? That's the sort of projects that I worked on. Deep, 13, 15,000 feet deep with pressures of 20,000 pounds per square inch, temperatures of 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Enormous energy from the earth. And the year I graduated, they invented the control devices that allowed us to drill for those prospects. And that's how I spent my 10-year career. in the oil business looking for those types of projects. They weren't even able to be drilled before that. And I had some success. But I learned that my ability to communicate risk to my managers and funders was the most important gift that I had. I had to be able to assess the risk and to tell them how it fit in with all of these multivariate things. And it gets down to being very different type of business because, like Robert Kaplan, professor at Harvard Business School, managing risk is different than managing strategy. The risk management focuses on negative threat and failures rather than opportunities and success. And that's really going to be the theme of a lot of the rest of my slides. Next slide. There's biblical proverbs about risk. You can look up and find a dozen of them. I just picked one from Proverbs. Prudent person foresees danger, takes precautions. Simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. The notion of stewardship in the face of risk is so important, and it tells us it's foolish to fail to recognize it. A wise person takes precautions and acts practically. Failing to do both can have disastrous consequences. Risk 101. This is taught in every business school. You understand risk based on a probability from unlikely to occur to a certainty that it will occur against a table of the impact of consequences. Little or no effect on the left. Results could result in disaster on the right. These are the things that have driven my work in environmental consulting, driving my work in water. So the next slide. And you're all familiar with the risk model. Smokey the Bear is probably the best one. Everybody knows the campaigns to prevent forest fires. And forest fires are a lot like groundwater contamination and water contamination. They're caused from anything to an unintentional minor act to an arsonist, the whole range. When the risk conditions are such that there's a risk of disaster, the red flags go up. The signs on the forest say high fire risk, you can't get a burning permit. And there's warning signs of those risks based on what we know. That's what I'm advocating we need for water and drinking water. We need a way to avoid the disasters across regions that have multiple sources of problems. So let's have the next slide. I'm going to talk about these. The title was Water Connects Us All. Well, it really does, and this is something that I've gained a huge appreciation of just even in the last year through working a lot with my Native American friends. It started with Minnesota well owners and back to my consulting days. And I'm going to cover a bunch of subjects here today. Western Winona County water crisis and our well organization, what we do, and the water connection that bring us here that might give us a better future for water. My talk isn't as comfortable as Emily's because I'm going to talk about a systemic failure. I see where I live. I own a farm. I have a well that I believe is 100 years old this year. It's 400 feet deep. When I bought it, it had 8.6 parts per million nitrates. By 2010, it had 20 parts per million nitrates. I haven't been able to drink the water in my well for well over a decade. For 10 years, I hauled water from a friend's house in St. Charles. 2 years ago, I put in a reverse osmosis system. There's no point where I live of drilling deeper. A deeper well will cost me $50,000. It will still be contaminated with nitrates. The bottom of my well is at the same elevation as the huge septic system of the Whitewater State Park. That's less than a mile as the crow flies. I would have to go so deep that the water is likely to have radium or other contaminants. I don't have a choice where I live in Western Winona County. And what we're facing here is unhealthy groundwater, it's unfit to drink, and periodic fish kills. 4 fish kills in the last 6 years. Next slide. And it's gone back 40 years. In the 1970s, the little town of Altura and Lewiston, brand new wastewater treatment systems paid for by the Clean Water Fund, or I'm sorry, the Clean Water Act, the federal act. Their sewage lagoons collapsed into sinkholes. Millions of gallons of sewage directly into the ground. I worked on another one in Belchester, Minnesota, the same thing. And the geologists and engineers didn't recognize the risk. But this really started an effort in southeastern Minnesota to understand that. It started the County Geologic Atlas program, where county by county we're putting together maps of the geology, what holds the water, what's the risk to the water. And even a dozen years later, the city of Lewiston decided to seal up all the sinkholes for their stormwater. All of the stormwater in town went into sinkholes. If it was street runoff, it went into the ground. And we could see the connection. It made groundwater and surface water the same thing. There's no distinction where I live. On my farm, the water does not leave my farm on the surface. I have a deep ravine, rocky ravine, and unless the ground is frozen, the runoff goes into that ravine and I can hear a sucking sound as it disappears into the earth. That is the water that I drink. That's the reason my well will never be safe, that I will always need treatment. Next slide. It's dramatic in public water supply systems. The town of Lewiston, 20 years ago, had 3 wells and they all came up above 10 parts per million nitrates, above the health risk standard where it's not safe for infants and pregnant women to drink the water. The engineers said, drill a deeper well. They drilled to 1,100 feet, found water that was contaminated with a geologic contaminant, radium. Not safe to drink, but you can blend the water with the nitrate water, and the combination would make it safe. And that's how Lewiston has been living since the 70s. Altura, a little town of 185 people, 80 households, right next door, this spring, got a violation notice. All of your wells are not healthy to drink. That town has no capacity to treat the water or drill a new well. 80 households. And who's going to pay for these disasters? It's going to be all of us, because we didn't prevent it from occurring in the first place. Next slide. Minnesota Department of Agriculture sent out free water testing clinics called townships in western Winona County. And in their initial sampling, they gauged how many people had water that wasn't safe to drink, over 10 parts per million. 47%, 55%, 34%. Half of people there, it's not safe to drink. We held a water testing clinic not far away, and we asked people how many people had reverse osmosis that would fix this problem and give them safe water. Out of 40 people, 1. People don't know enough about this to protect themselves. And I say that this is a failure. We know this. We know to advise people about this. Next slide. And if you've noticed, I put my little risk management chart on the very corner there. And in every one of these, I've cited what's an intolerable risk. It's an intolerable risk to have 4 fish kills in 6 years. Rush Creek, just a little over a month ago, killed all the fish in at least 1.2 miles. The first big one in our area, South Branch of the Whitewater, 6.7 miles, it killed all the aquatic organisms. I went out there 2 days later and I found a line of dead crawfish 3 feet above the water line. They crawled out of the water and died. That means it's a toxin. That's not an oxygen event. That's not a dirty, silty water event. And we found that there's common causes at every one of these fish kills. It starts with cutting hay. And the common practice now for feedlots that don't have adequate storage is to spread manure on top of the cut hay. And they're doing that at the time of year when the streams are already warm and the fish are under stress. And they're spraying exceedingly toxic pesticides from helicopters nearby, fungicides in particular, that are toxic at 3 parts per billion. You can barely sample and analyze that in some labs. And Winona State University went out and did a study and put automated stream samplers in 6 spots, and they found the fungicides in 84% of the samples, on runoff samples. And when they brought that data to the ag department, they said, well, your data isn't valid. You didn't use our technique to sample the water. And the university said, yeah, but we used one that is sensitive to parts per trillion. You're using something that's sensitive 100 times higher. And the ag department said, oh, it doesn't matter because the test has to be over 4 days. And you only have single incidents. They found 6 occurrences where the water concentration was above the toxic level, right where I live, all within 10 miles of Lewis, all in western Winona County, the same places where we don't have good community water, where we have private wells. And they're all in the range of those tolerable risks. Next slide. So, what is it with our water crisis? We're told constantly, move along, there's nothing to see. This is the narrative we're hearing in southeastern Minnesota. This is the narrative that's embedded in some of our watershed plans that I object to. Instead of creating trust and taking a risk management view, we've taken a strategic management view, where strategies are about the good things you can do and the good things you can feel and the good things that might happen if. And I'm saying we need triage about the intolerable risks first. We can't have a valid watershed plan until we recognize you can't have a fish kill every year. You can't have 50% of the water without drinking water quality. You can't have towns seeking money from state agencies to fix the water supplies. And part of the problem is we've weaponized uncertainty. When I talk to the people, Emily's boss, and say, you know the probabilities of these things, but we can't prove it. You know what? A risk manager doesn't care. It's about probabilities of failure. It's not about a certainty. We default to that scientifically, and we're not taking into account what we really need to do to connect with people to change this. Next slide. Despite our knowledge, we know all this. We know farming on karst is sensitive. We know groundwater is connected to the surface. They're the same thing. That we have seasonal runoff, scientific regulations or investigations, but there's no regulation or liability. We asked about all of the chemicals in the water besides nitrates. Dakota County has found that if you have 3 parts per million nitrates, a 90% probability of 6 or more pesticides. You have a cocktail of pesticides if you're well below the health risk. And they're saying, we don't understand why people are outraged. Why can't we stop this? And it's tragic. And no one's taking responsibility, and no one can really be blamed individually. We have a social problem. We have a problem that we're not engaging our souls in the very thing that connects us. Common causes of fish kill, every one of those 4 were the same. Second or third cutting hay, manure spreading, 8,000 gallons an acre. Budding crops sprayed with fungicides. Heavy rainfall causes runoff. The first of these big fish kills, they had hay in the drainage ways, in the waterways. They cut the hay and they spread the manure in the waterways and had a 10-inch rain. Well, where'd the manure go? It went and it killed the fish, it killed the crawfish, it killed everything in 6 miles of stream. We we have a systemic failure. Next slide. We know a lot about it, and I'm going to show you some of the things quickly that we know that could be used as a risk management approach. They're risk strategies, but they're not being effective. Next slide. Minnesota rules say manure management plan must contain measures to minimize the risk of surface and groundwater contamination when applying manure, and it tells you why. That's in the rules. It's a must. Next slide. They say to use this map from the soil survey. The red here are areas of sensitive soils for nutrient management. If you're farming on these red soils, this is the headwaters of the fish gill. Rush Creek is right here. All fish up in here. Just a month ago, 85 to 90% high-risk soils. And it says you must, next slide, use this form, manure management planning guides for sensitive areas. It lists the sensitive areas, lake streams, wetlands, open tile inlets, sinkholes, floodplains. And it says if your map shows those sensitive areas, you need a separate worksheet for your manure application to figure out how you're going to avoid disaster, how you're going to avoid the risk. I asked for a Freedom of Information Act request from Winona County. Next slide. And I asked, am I going to find this stuff from these farms? And this is the manual. It's a cartoon. It's easy to understand. It says if you have a sinkhole, you're within 300 feet, you must inject or incorporate within 24 hours. You don't do that on a hayfield. You never cut the roots of an alfalfa crop. That's what you're trying to strengthen so that you have longevity. The same thing on streams. You're within 300 feet, inject within 24 hours. Ignore it. Next slide. I asked the feedlot officer, I had a very unpleasant conversation. I said, I thought your job was to protect the water. And she told me on no uncertain terms, her job was to protect the farmers. She's not advising the farmers how to avoid the risk. She's not helping them by keeping them away. I learned that they inspect the farm in Winona County on average once every 11 to 13 years. The farm we think was implicated in this has not been inspected since it was permitted in 2013. And she sent me, in my Freedom of Information Act request, a conditional use permit. This is what the county board agreed to when they approved the farm. And they took a standard condition that reads, the proposed feedlot avoids exposing adjacent properties and natural features to adverse effects. And they added 2 words. The proposed feedlot will not avoid exposing adjacent properties. And they added a clause. The feedlot will have the potential to contaminate water. And it was approved and signed by the chair of the county board and the county attorney. We have a county that has intentionally recognized the risk and avoided it. They want to get along with the farmers. They want to be the protectors of the farmers. And I don't see you can do it this way. The next slide. I want to show you the farm. Rush Creek is here. Fishkill started about here, we believe, meandered around. This is I-90 and Lewiston exit. Within this watershed area, there's 3 different feedlots, about 800 animal units between these 2 that are all together, and this one another 250. And geologists have done a lot of work in the same area. The map on the right-hand side is a nitrate study, where we prove the connection between surface and groundwater. Geologists go out and pour water in a sinkhole and see where it comes out. On this farm, they poured the water in a sinkhole here. 3 days later, it came out in a spring here. And the dye showed up for an additional 5 days. We have the proof that surface water and groundwater are connected. And that what you do in this area is at risk. And we know from an earlier fish kill on Garden Brook, where it was a losing stream. Geologists recognize it flows along and lose volume, so they put a dye where the stream was losing water. and it came out of 2 wells 2 miles away. And yet we're not alerting people of the risks to their wells. And when I asked the sanitarian at the county, he said, oh, fish kills aren't related to drinking water. Well, how can someone say that? How can someone say that? Next slide. I want to show you the farm, some of the details. It's 1920 or 2021. The stream is on the north. This is a hay field. You can see the cutting hay equipment right there. The sinkhole inset, you can see the big sinkholes, and they're cutting the hay right around the sinkholes. They're farming right up to the edge of it. And this whole part is manure spreading right after they cut hay. They caught this at the perfect time. As to this field, they didn't even try to grow hay because they had too much manure. They needed a spot where they could spread the manure at any time. So we see the risk, but those without that adequate manure storage have to rely on getting rid of it somehow, sometime before it overflows. And we're not advising people of the risk. Next slide. This is a series of air photos of the same farm, focused on the pond. On the top, you can see that was all pasture. That's a fence on both sides. It's all cattle pasture in 2018 with crops on the flatter ground. The map shows the high-risk areas at a little different scale, but you can see that it's predominantly in that high-risk area that should have these water management documents in place to think about it. When I asked the feedlot officer if I'm going to find those in the file, she said, oh no, we don't use those anymore. They're old. And this is what's happened in 2015. Look at the scum on the pond. This is all cropland right up to the pond. Exposed bedrock right here. Anything soaking right into the bedrock in June 2020, cropped all around. In April 2021 to the next slide. This was last spring. Spreading manure before they planted the crops. And you can see it's so heavy, it's running right off into the pond. Irrefutable disregard for our water. So we don't know, is this an arsonist that we have to be careful of the risk? Or is it an unknowing action that they didn't know enough to protect? Trout habitat project right below the farm. The farm buildings are 200 feet from the building. Contractor reported a 15-inch culvert coming from the cattle yard into the stream. Reported to DNR, and they came back 2 days later. We expected them to say, take that culvert out. They said, no, don't worry, he's got a valve on that. He never uses it. Leave it in. There is no feedlot permit in Minnesota that would allow a direct pipe discharge to a stream. And yet there was no inspection. There was no follow-up whatsoever. And we still don't know whether they opened the valve. And the advice we get, bad weather advice from the Pollution Control Agency doesn't mention summertime application of manure on hay crops. It doesn't even alert people of the risks. Next slide. And our fish kill manual compounds this. In 2016, I was so incensed about the fact that it was a Keystone Cops affair. They were collecting mason jars to try to get water samples 3 days after the fish kill. I convinced Governor Dayton to issue an executive order that they must put together a fish kill manual for Minnesota waters to prepare people with training and supplies and equipment, a protocol, and a chain of command. But the section on communication in that, it's the quote, almost all data are protected, non-public or confidential until the investigation is closed. They won't tell us anything about the fish. And they continue to breed the attitude of mistrust. The farmers don't trust them because they're being investigated. They just told me they don't trust me with the data. And even the press doesn't trust them when they're talking about these things. So we're not getting to the point of prevention ever. The last investigation South Branch happened the end of July. They dropped the report on Christmas Eve. And it said we couldn't identify the person that caused the risk. We think it's a number of factors. That's risk management. You've identified the probabilities that create the disaster. So I said to the agency just a week ago, I said, what if your narrative for a fish kill was not, it's bad that it happened, it's likely a man-made event, we're under investigation and we'll tell you later. What if that narrative was, we've had another fish kill, this is terrible, you too could prevent this. You could use the data to prevent this. Hay cutting, manure application, fungicide applications in July are the elements. We can have a warning system that's effective, but we're not. Agencies strive for certainty and promote the strategic management, but it prevents them from practicing risk management. Cartoonists from the early 1900s in public, lots of folks confuse bad management with destiny. I hear all the time, this is how it is in farm country. I can't accept that. I can't accept that it's destiny. So we come back to this. We have intolerable consequences. We have groundwater contamination for township after township, city after city. We have routine fish kills, and yet we're not advising people on how to avoid the risk. We're not yet to the point where we're telling people, you too can prevent this. Next slide. We need help. Then we look at how we fail and who's going to protect us. And you know what? Landowners, farmers, municipal water suppliers, private well owners have all failed to protect their own interests. We haven't figured out how to do that. And we have a whole list, all that list that Emily talked about, of the state agencies that have failed to protect the public. Decade after decade. I've been working on this for 40 years where I live. And we have a systemic failure that we have to bring back into our soul, into our understanding and our care for our water. When I drove here today, I drove an hour from near St. Charles. And I realized I don't have any connection to this land. I don't have any connection to the crops that are out there. But every time I crossed the water, I understood the connection. I have a connection to everybody and everything with that water. And when I drink my glass of water here, anywhere I go, I have that connection. And that's the message we need. Next slide. The risk is that we've made this a norm. We've made this a norm. Our watershed plan that's going to be out for public review in weeks doesn't mention fish kills. Doesn't even happen in the text. It doesn't highlight the connection between surface and groundwater or the risky activities that happen, and it has 31 priorities. I'm sorry, the definition of a priority is singular. You can't have 31 priorities and think you're going to have an impact on problems that are disasters, that are intolerable consequences. We can't soft shoe this. Next slide. I'm going to segue to what I think I can do and what I'm doing through my organization, through the Minnesota Well Owners Organization. We started off in 2018. Just before COVID, and we started using the maps about groundwater risk. Nice geologic maps that have a lot of meaning to me. Their probability for groundwater contamination. We found that people objected to that because they thought we were blaming someone for the problem. And that's not what we wanted to be concerned about. We wanted to be concerned about the health of their water at their kitchen sink. We were having people come to our clinics and say, well, you're not going to tell the government about my test results, are you? Can I trust you? And we turned around this narrative, and now we have farmers bringing in the samples from all of their kids that live in the neighborhood and say, you care about our kitchen sink, our health here, and you're going to help us understand what to do. This really came out of a notion in my work at St. Mary's, where I learned that philanthropy and nonprofits can do things that government can't do. And we can do things that business won't do. That's how we're here today. We're doing those things. And it's in so many places we're a bridge between citizens and policymakers. And we can reach people that government can't reach. And we can identify and focus on local problems or national problems. We have all the elements, and there's a big body of knowledge and experience in philanthropy and nonprofits. I got to tell you, it disappointed me when I learned that there's 3 essential philanthropies: faith, health, and education. All other philanthropies are seen as non-essential. That made me feel a little small. But we need to be up there, and it still gives us a place to show how work we do is important. Next slide. So we incorporated 501c3, developed our mission, did a couple of small clinics in Preston and Mabel and Stewartville, and COVID hit. So we were done. I mean, we thought our mission was undone, but we pivoted to planning and collaboration. It's one of the best things we did. We spent 2020 and most of 2021 collaborating with a group called the Minnesota Groundwater Association. One of my interests was in recruiting volunteers to stay involved in their profession and help people with issues like this. And Groundwater Association was losing 30 people a year to retirement. So they said, well, let's collaborate. And we got together a group of 30 professionals, most of them retired, with over 500 years of experience with Minnesota Water, on how we put together a volunteer program. We put together 7 teams, you can believe it, and we had weekly Zoom meetings. We addressed recruiting volunteers, resources you need for clinics, resources for well owners, how do you select what to analyze for, what are the best management practices for clinics, the data available, and how do you evaluate it. And we've got a growing list of partners. We have over 50 partners now that have helped us across the state, all the way from the White Earth Reservation on the Northwest to watershed projects in the metro and our local area. So it really helped. And it brought apart something that I think is so important and it's overlooked. It's an economic theory. Attention economy, Nobel Prize for this, that says the most important valuable thing a person has is their attention. And it's consumed 85 or 90% of the time with your routine matters. It's your life, it's your family, it's your job. And when you gain somebody's attention out of that little piece that's left, in order to capture it, you have to make them look forward to the next thing, plan to do something or take some action. And there's whole social science about how you do this. It doesn't help to put the word out when nobody's listening. A fish kill, an attention-grabbing affair. We can know when we're talking to people. We broke it down, and in our, next slide, in our clinics, we know we have 5 points of tension. It's the first notice of our well testing clinic where people think, well, that's a good idea, maybe I should watch. And the second one is when we give all the details, time, place, put it on your calendar. And the third place is when they come to the clinic and we're inviting them to bring their water samples in. And the fourth is when we report their results. And the last is the follow-up. And we've developed messages for each of those. We just analyzed our evaluations from these water clinics on a scale of 1 to 6. 90% give us a 5.5. or better. People like this approach. We're gaining their attention. We're giving them options on what to do with the results. And that's interesting because 80% of the people have good water. And it's so important to get people to feel grateful for that. Gratefulness is one of the most powerful human emotions. And when people feel grateful for the water, they think about, how do I protect it? Where's the risk? And there's no shame and there's no blame. This is the water at your kitchen sink. This is what you have to deal with. And for those that have bad water, water clinics in the past have dropped them in the wilderness. Here's your bad water result. That's too bad. Well, we have professionals that come to these, hydrologists and well drillers and engineers who say, here's your test. These are the options of what you have to do. These are places you can get an alternative water supply, the type of treatment you need. And we're helping people understand those and follow up with that consultation. These risks occur everywhere. Beginning in March of 2020, the Health Department of the University of Minnesota issued a report that is the future of Minnesota drinking water. And they proposed a program that's called water safety plans. And it's different than what we do in the United States with our water under the Safe Drinking Water Act and other things, because it starts at the kitchen sink. And for every place your water quality has a risk, it assigns a risk manager and said, you can do this to solve this problem. And it's your home, oftentimes. Lead in water is oftentimes your home, pipes, or your water faucet. But you go all the way to the aquifer contamination end, and then it's a whole group of people. It's a community of people that have to be involved. And we need a plan like this. Everybody thinks about the risk and manages that. You have to be aware and identify it. Next slide. The thing that is important to understand, though, is safe water as a source does not guarantee safe water at your tap. We see bacteria contamination from water softeners. Putting the salt in there. No, dog peed on the pile of salt out at the Super America. You have a contamination issue with your water softener. These are things you can manage. You can test for and manage those risks. But the same way, bad water at source does not require that you drink that bad water. That's the status of all of those 50% of people in Western Winona County. They think, oh, that's all I have for water to drink. But we've heard of 2 cases in the last year where people have not been able to have live farm animals born on their property because of contaminated water. That's a crisis. That's a triage. That's something that we need to address. Next slide. What's critical? Shared water values. We don't have those. Our law prevents it from happening in Minnesota. Emily showed you all the state agencies. We have what's called polycentric management, another economic theory, that basically says you deal with silos and you protect your interests. And it seems like a good way to get community involvement in your water issue, but in the final analysis, it makes you defensive of everyone else's uses. Irrigators are a good example. For the last 5 years, they've been going to the legislature. There is a law that says if your irrigation well dries up somebody's well, you're responsible to replace their water supply. 5 years running in the legislature, they've come in and said, well, we don't think we should pay for old wells. There's a bill out there perennially. If the well's over 15 years old, it's completely amortized. We don't owe those people a new water supply. They're trying to exclude private well owners from their interests. That's our style of management here in Minnesota. Risk management at every point needs to be understood and how to control the transport and fate of those contaminants. Those are critical, but they're the same list as what's missing. We don't have shared water values. We don't have focus on the kitchen sink, we don't have water tests. The watershed plans say we won't test water for wells. That's the health department's responsibility. The health department isn't even involved. They're absent without leave here on all of these issues. So where do we go? We need those cooperative measures. Next slide. But we're not getting them. So we have things that we are in good shape. We have good water supply systems across the state, really good, good record of that. Water sources that are reliable and safe in most instances. And we know pollution sensitivity and effective risk management. We need resources. But we're not dealing with realistic costs. A bill at the legislature last year by the Water Treatment Association said they would like to fund water treatment for everybody in Minnesota that needs it. $46 million per biennium for the next 10 years. $500 million in asking state funds because of what we've done, because of our failure to prevent it in the first instance. Next slide. 2.1 people drink water with high arsenic. We have other problems. Throughout Minnesota, we're seeing 15 or 20% that have a geologic contaminant of arsenic that's not being addressed either. We address it when they drill the well, but there's no treatment requirements, and it's a risk. Next slide. And we're failing to take a public health attitude about this. And this is one of the things I've really learned through some cooperation with the department or the University of Minnesota Extension Service. Public health people know how to present risk to people that are in the way of risk. You think about where you run into public health. It's early childhood, it's neonatal care, it's vaccinations. And you know what? I'm a geologist. I never learned that. I never learned how to communicate. We need that clarity. And we need the graphics. And I'm saying these two things tell us more than my watershed plan. Next slide. And these two things show us the consequences in a no-nonsense way. Next slide. And here we're promoting everyone getting a certified laboratory test, and to test it periodically for coliform, nitrate, arsenic, lead, and manganese. Next slide. And we do get there and make people understand these issues about risk management on their own. Safe water is the same as food security. You can't have food security without safe water. And we give a lot of talk to grocery deserts and places like that. But look at Western Winona County. Half of the people don't have safe water in their kitchen sink. We can't have that. So we need your help. We're putting on these well clinics all over the state. We're happy to help host those. We've got a program in place that takes 8 weeks to plan it. But we've got it down to where it's really easy. A Zoom call once a week for 8 weeks, and we'll knock it out of the park. And we've been setting records. In the last 2 months, we've had over 700 people come to water clinics across the state. So there's my contact information. I'm going to talk just really briefly next slide. I'm kind of going over time a little bit. But let's focus on what we need. We need a Smokey the Bear approach that's helping people understand what the problems are and helping them understand the risk. Instead of a strategic management, we need a risk management, a triage. These are unacceptable. And we need to focus our resources on eliminating those. Next slide. And there's some great things out here. Good tool by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. It's called the Minnesota Runoff Risk Advisor. Takes us through 5-day weather forecast. It's an app on the phone. I signed up. It will alert me on my phone when the risk of runoff is high. But you know who regulates and deals with feedlots in Minnesota? Not the Ag Department. It's the Pollution Control Agency. It's the county feedlot office. They don't even post this on their website. They don't even show people how to use the existing tools. Next slide. Then we have a one watershed, one plan. A plan for our area that doesn't recognize fish kills as a risk, doesn't recognize the connection between surface and groundwater, and it gives us 31 priorities to fund farmer programs to do the same thing they're doing now. We're not making progress. I'll pivot really quickly and talk about what I've learned working on line 3 from Enbridge. Terry will maybe talk about this a little more later, but what I really wanted to stress is the important things I've learned from dealing with the Native American community in northern Minnesota. And I'm not going to tell you their stories, they're theirs to tell, but I want to tell you how they've affected me. I started with this after a water clinic we had up on the reservation. A couple weeks later, one of the friends sent me a report from the Pollution Control Agency about an aquifer breach where Enbridge had dug too deep and burst an artesian aquifer. It turned this work site into quicksand. And when they put the water in a pipe, it shot 9 feet above the ground. And I have geologic experience with these things. It's very, very difficult and expensive to fix. There have been complete failures to fix that. And I was writing a report about this for a group of lobbyists that I'm working with. And I was worried that I would say something that was offensive to my Native American hosts. I'd ask them if I could work in their territory and use my science experience where they live to help understand and deal with this problem. And I called my attorney friend, Frank Bebo, and said, Frank, I'm really nervous that I'm going to say something really stupid. I'm kind of prone to ask stupid questions or get out of line, and it would be, I don't want to offend anybody. Can I talk to someone about your ideas about water, the culture and spirit of your water? And I was driven to this because I wrote an article, a series of articles a couple of years ago about the karst region in southern Minnesota. I was researching how people came to understand that to be true, and I came across a Dakota story about the springs, headwater springs of the Bedote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi River, a holy place where they believe man was formed. The big spring there is sacred, and it's the home of their god of medicine. And that's the front door to his world that's unknowable. And that struck me as a scientist. That was a scientific explanation for them of the mystery of this connection of water. How is it that this water was fresh and upwelling there all the time? And the story was even more interesting because Zebulon Pike, when he came up, one of the conquerors of the Midwest, his men were all sick. And the Indians said, come see our god of medicine. Drink the water here at the front door of our God will heal you. And Zebulon Pike took over the spring. Became Fort Snelling. They culturally appropriated. When I asked Frank, he put me in contact with Dale Green, one of the tribal elders of Red Lake. Dale was about the third person who told me the origin story about Shabbat, and it's a story of migration where their great spirit was always looking for the next best place to live. And he gave a vision to one of, they lived out on the Atlantic coast, and gave a vision that said, go west to where you find food that grows on water. And this was at the end of the glaciation, where there was still an ice sheet in Canada. And as they did that, they found wild rice, fish in abundance. And he said, water is the essence of our region. It connects everything we have. And Dale did a brilliant thing. He asked me a question. He said, do you like the sound of water? And I said, I love it. I'm an angler, trout fisherman, sound of waves that said, Jeff, us, that's the sound of songs and prayers. And what you've told me is, I now have to go to the pipeline. I was about to ask him if springs were safe. It's so much deeper. It's so much deeper. And when I was in college, I was looking around and I did a research project about the culture and spirituality of water, and everything I read in Western academic literature was about stewardship as dominance, being in charge of the resources. Eastern literature, a lot different. But then I turned on the news and I saw water protectors out on Keystone who were walking the talk. They were there to protect the water. And it was deeply felt and understood. And it's part of the culture that we learn so much from. And there's a long Christian tradition that I've learned since of protecting the water. I thank you so much for your words today to highlight those places where we might have missed some of the words in the past about how we dominate things, that we have to be part of all of this. I convinced the tribes to invest in a high resolution tool, an infrared flight across the entire line that would show us where groundwater is upwelling wherever the pipeline occurred. Go to the next slide. This is the Lime Tree pipeline. The bright spots are warm water upwelling through frozen ground. And here, this is actually an old lime tree. There's so much upwelling water in that pipeline, the beavers have moved in. Here's an occupied beaver dam. You can see the heat of the beavers. And you can see the life they form from an impact of a pipeline. They have colonialized and captured the water to move tar sands from Edmonton to Lake Superior. And I can't think of a more tragic outcome than to not hold Enbridge and our regulators responsible for the damage that's been done. Here's another case where they identified and had problems. They put in a sheet pile, broke down long sheet pile so that they could get a narrow trench and dewater it. When they pulled out the sheet pile, the water came spouting up 19 feet above the surface and turned it into quicksand. Then they went out and fixed it, and still after they fixed it, we count 32 points that the water's still seeping out of the ground. We have the technology to understand this. We have the words to talk about the risk, but we're not applying the management when it matters, when the permits come up, when we need to take care of the next time. And it introduced me to people who are dealing with the rights of the known. Terry's going to talk about this, so I don't want to steal his thunder in any way because he's really eloquent about what it means. But you think about what it means to have that right. It's not just a constitutional right, it's a spiritual right that we're not recognizing, that we need to recognize in order to protect our water. So what can an old white scientist learn about nature? Water is life. And the water protects. The heart, sacred heart that I saw on the outside of the church. I got some questions. We had a quick question. Yes, it's an oil pipeline, 36-inch, bringing tar sands oil across Minnesota. Pardon me? Yes, they dug through in, we believe, 45 places into artesian aquifers where that water had equilibrated and stayed in those deeper aquifers. And actually, they're 30 feet deep, most of them, and it's upwelling to the surface in an uncontrolled rate. Yes.
If I understand it right, 23 pipeline services tar sands. Now, this tar sands, it's too costly for us to refine down so it meets our specifications for gasoline. So it's shipped over to China, which they burn it, then it goes into the atmosphere, and you know what it does to the planet. I mean, and we know that's doing it. And we allowed that pipeline to start digging and putting it down this way before they even had all the permits and everything to do it.
Right. It's, in my opinion, a tragic situation. It's interesting that they got the permit because of the economic need and the benefit. And as soon as they finished the pipeline, they said, oh, well, we don't think this will actually be a 50-year project because we think electric transition to transportation vehicles is going to shorten that life. And they came back and said, oh, we're sorry, we can't get insurance on this anymore. So we're going to self-insure our water damage. Time after time after time. They did engineering reviews of the risk of these, and even though they had soil borings that showed artesian pressures, the engineers said no risk. Time after time. And that's a lack of risk management. Again, we know the issues, we know how to control them, we know how to advise to avoid it. Yeah, the back.
Is that where that pipe burst? Is that on Native property?
Yes. That is a really important question. And I'm really moved, and I hope Terry talks about this. It's on ceded territory. The Ojibwa, during their treaty negotiations, maintained the right to sustain themselves, and they named out hunting, fishing, gathering, wild rice, and maple syrup. The federal government allowed them to retain those rights off the reservation within that ceded territory.
But don't they have the right to establish their own water standards?
Yes, they do. And Fond du Lac tribe has now done that. White Earth has not. The Bad River tribe, where Line 5 is going through, has that right now. And they're working directly with the US EPA instead of the state agencies because they've taken on that right for those water quality.
So is there legislative litigation going on?
Yes, yes. And that's why I've been invited to be part of the litigation strategy. Frank people and a number of attorneys from across the country for those rights and nature issues. Oh, I'm sorry for that. Thanks. Thank you. You had a question?
I just have a clarification question. So when these ruptures happen, is the oil contaminating the aquifer? The aquifer is just ruptured so that it's exploding.
The question was, in these areas, is there petroleum coming to the surface? No, the water's still contained in the pipe. This is the damage they've done to our natural water system. Other questions? Thank you so much for your attention today, and help us.
Thank you, Jeff. I do want to just ask, because we're getting a bit over time, is it all right with everybody if we go a little past 2? Does that work for most people? Yeah, well, I don't want to shorten it too much though, so, yeah. Okay, so why don't we, we'll have lunch started, starting now, have it finish at, we'll say 1:25. 1:25. And that'll give us equal amount of time. So, Father, would you want to lead us in prayer?
We thank God for the gift of life and health and strength for family and friends. Bless this food and those who have prepared it. Bless those who do not have enough to eat this day. Bless us, O Lord,
And these thy gifts,
which we are about to receive
from thy bounty through Christ our Lord.
in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thanks, Father. And I do want to just take the time again to thank Jeff because he has to leave right away. So thank you. We're about to begin with our third speaker, and he's joining us via Zoom. So after I do the introduction, I'll have to get everything set up so he's projected on there correctly. But it's my pleasure to introduce Terry Janis. Terry Janis Oglala Lakota is director of the Navy Center's Institute for the Rights of Nature. Over the previous 15 years, Terry served as executive director for Water Protector Legal Collective, or WPLC, president at White Earth Tribal and Community College, manager of the White Earth Nation Constitution Reform Process, and program officer at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. In the 15 years before that, Terry has worked extensively on Native American and international Indigenous education and human rights issues. Working through organizations such as the University of Arizona, the Indian Law Resource Center, and Northern Arizona University, Terry has consistently combined education and law to work with Indian leaders and students to advocate for Indigenous rights. Terry holds a bachelor's degree from McAllister College, a master's in education from Harvard University, and a law degree from the University of Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Terry.
So I will just begin, and you all will tell me if the audio is not good. But in addition to that, I want to make this a dialogue as much as anything. I really appreciate the information and material that Emily and Jeffrey presented earlier. Amazing job, Isaac, in pulling together a varied and really balanced speakers group. As you got from my brief introduction, I'm Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge Reservation. And I've been working in this field for all of my career. The rights of nature work is relatively recent for me. But it comes at a time in my life when I am, at 62 years of age, profoundly affected by my own personal relationship with the earth, as we say in Lakota, Ina Maka, Mother Earth. And this work that I'm going to present some information on has been profoundly meaningful to me, and I'm happy to be a part of it. In this presentation, what I'll do is tell you a little bit about the organization that I work for, the Nibby Center, and then I'll dive into the work that we're doing on rights of nature, and I'll attempt to respond to some of the questions that you had earlier, especially for Jeffrey, on the stuff that's been happening with Line 3, the status of that litigation, and where it seems to be going. If there's any questions at any point along the way, please feel free to interrupt and jump in. And I want this to be as engaging and responsive as possible. So to start this off, I'll share screen. So as I said, I work with an organization called the Nibby Center. We're based in White Earth Reservation and established within the community with a core mission of being a catalyst for research, advocacy, and activism grounded in Indigenous culture and knowledge to protect and advance Anishinaabe prophecy, sovereignty, and cultural survival. That as a core kind of idea that reflects the purpose and existence of the Nibby Center is something that I support profoundly. And as well as the vision of the Nibby Center, which is our goal that Anishinaabe communities will know and understand their language, teaching, and ceremonies to fulfill Minobe Mataziwin, which is the Ojibwe word for good life, and the sacred promises and responsibilities for Nibi, water, Monoman, wild rice, in all of nature for future generations. The kind of programming of the Nibi Center really emerged out of a goal of the organization to make sure that the voice of Indigenous women is at the center of everything that we do. And in the kind of process of establishing the organization and defining its programming, we spent the first couple years really centering on Indigenous women within the wider communities. And so that programming area of traditional women remains at the fore and a critical part of the organizing that we do as the Nibi Center. But out of those conversations, the emphasis points of historic trauma, rights of nature, and language immersion were really the ideas that came to the forefront in a very dynamic sort of way. And again, this is the voice of Indigenous women, in particular elder women within the community. And each one of these areas deserves a full couple hours in order to really fully develop what they mean. Historic trauma emerges from the historical interaction between Indigenous communities and the government and military of the United States of America. Language immersion is a response in many ways to that historic trauma, a recognition that we as Indigenous peoples, in order to deal with the trauma that has been forced upon us, we need to go and utilize the core tools and the core resources that we have within our culture, within our spiritual path, and with us as a people. And so language really comes forward as a critical component of that. And then the rights of nature work really comes out of the recognition that in every aspect of our cultural and personal lives, our relationship with the land is a critical component, not only of what helps us to deal with and heal from the traumas that we've suffered as a people, but in our individual lives, the ability of each of us to realize our full selves, you know? And it's interesting that whenever I first left Pine Ridge, my first trip out of that region was to visit Macalester College in St. Paul. And when I got accepted and started school there and I got to know people, my first reaction was, these people don't have culture. And it wasn't that term culture didn't reflect the richness of their lives, because, you know, the folks that go to Macalester are incredibly vibrant and dynamic people. But for my way of thinking, it was their lack of connection to the land, to the earth. And that culture for me was defined by my relationship with the land, the experiences that I gained in, you know, just leaving my house at sunrise, catching our horses, and connecting up with my friends and riding all day, drinking the water from the creeks and eating the food from the land, digging timsilas and berries and other things, and really letting the land nurture us in that way, and letting that horse nation heal us from the daily traumas that we suffered, learning the language with each other, and just having a good day on the land. That dynamic and that relationship with the land was what for me defined culture at that early point in my life. And as I got to know the people within the Macalester system, both white folks, black folks, Latina, etc., it became imperative for me to accept the fact that the level of ignorance about Indigenous peoples in the Americas was astounding. And that if I was going to build relationships and engage with people, that I had to accept myself as an educator. And that really started to form one of the grounding principles of my life, that my abilities and tactics and skills as an educator, somebody that is willing to share my life, is a core part of what I had to do in order to build a community within this non-Indian world. And then as I moved on and really started to learn the history of my people, because this doesn't happen in K through 12, and it doesn't happen at university just on its own. I had to go out and seek it and engage it and learn it. And the more I learned, the angrier I got. And the more I learned, the more I realized that the fight was just as important as the education, that I had to find a way to combine educating and understanding with an engagement in the fight that was necessarily a part of our continued survival. And so this kind of balance between education and law became my focal point, and that's why I went to law school and continued on to developed the career that I pursued. I described earlier the various components of the programming at the NIBI Center. Within the rights of nature work, what we're doing is really a three-scale sort of programming engagement. The first and most important is local engagement, a recognition not only from, especially the comments that Jeffrey talked about in professionally, how he emerged into that as well, but also, looking at in preparing for this, looking at Pope Francis's material on in 2015 in his commentary on our relationship with the environment. The key thing that comes out on me in reading through that is the emphasis on local engagement, the need for us as human beings to move away from a patriarchal, hierarchical relationship with the earth and really develop a local emphasis in which our personal relationship and our personal involvement with the earth adjusts and fits, and that we engage at the local level to be active participants in that process. And so that's the primary emphasis of the Institute for the Rights of Nature. And then it extends from there, recognizing that regardless of how much success we do or do not have at the local level, the surrounding communities, the regional engagement, the national, has to be an extension of that. It's the very nature of the environmental laws within the United States of America that a recognition that nature should have legally enforceable rights, that nature is an entity in and of herself, a being that exists, and that in that existence should be responded to and respected, not only within our own personal and local relationships, but also in relation to the laws itself. And so on a regional engagement, we recognize that the success that we have at the local level has to expand beyond that. It has to expand out so that we're connecting local areas of communities that have an understanding and respect for rights of nature, and how that interacts with the surrounding county, the surrounding municipality, the surrounding state. And so that kind of regional engagement is an important part of our work as well. And then thirdly, at a national and international level, a recognition that this necessarily brings us into the conversation about policy and law development, international standards, and the whole ball of wax. So that's how our Institute for the Rights of Nature programming is broadly established. Coming back to that specific strategy of engagement, of community focus, of learning in the community and support in the community. One of the things that is a point of emphasis of ours is that a community necessarily learns together. And that when we engage at the local level, it's not just about us coming in and say, look, we have the answer, right? It's about us coming in and learning from that community who they are and what their points of emphasis are in relation to not only rights of nature, but their specific relationships to nature. And taking the time to learn that, to study that, to research that, and not just on our own, but with the community itself. And then within that process, design the kind of focal points of engagement, the goals of that community in relation to shaping laws, policies, procedures, and practices to enforce rights of nature within that community. And so we take the time to make sure that we deeply understand what's going on within that community, and then that we engage together with the priorities that are defined by that community. Within Wide Earth, the point of emphasis there has already been defined in 2018 with the Rights of Monoman Ordinance. The Wide Earth governing body, the Reservation Business Committee, it's called, established that legislation by resolution in 2018, right at the very end of the year. And the kind of core language that for me defines what that right is about is that Monoman or wild rice within the Wide Earth Reservation possesses inherent rights to exist, to flourish, to regenerate and evolve, as well as inherent rights of restoration, recovery, and preservation. And it was critical for us to respect that language and to really develop an understanding of what that language meant within the community. So in order to do that, what we did is brought together a group of 4 Indigenous women who were really well-respected elders within the community, and with them designed a series of questions, like a questionnaire. And we also worked with them to identify who within the community had the deepest knowledge about not only Monoman or wild rice, but what it means to the community, right? Ricing, or the gathering of Monoman, is a critical part of the culture and the economy of that community. And so we wanted to ask individuals within the community that had deep understanding, deep experience and knowledge about wild rice, ricing, and the culture and spirituality around it. And so we did a series of interviews. We identified about 30 individuals and were able to successfully interview about half of them, around 15. And each of these individuals gave us incredible knowledge about what Monoman meant to the community and the kind of mechanisms that could be put in place that would take this language on the Rights of Monoman Ordinance and really apply it in a regulatory mechanism that made sense for the community, that strengthened the community and revitalized the community, and included the community in the process of not only defining what these terms mean, right, for Monoman to exist, to flourish, and to evolve, and when it gets harmed, to restoration and recovery and preservation. And we worked with the community members to define each of those terms and develop a regulatory standard, of regulatory mechanisms that we're now working with the Wide Earth Division of Natural Resources to communicate with the various communities on Wide Earth and have conversations within those communities about what this regulatory mechanism means, how it would roll out within the community, what it would mean for each of those communities, and the kind of educational practices and other activities from enforcement to support, how all of those components would mean to each of those communities. Before I move on, it was a really amazing process of having these deep conversations with individuals and getting to know, especially me as a Lakota man from Pine Ridge, who's lived on White Earth for the last 10 years or so, and worked with White Earth for the last 10 years in a variety of different positions. But to really get to know something that was not in my wheel well. Right? If you guys have ever been to Pine Ridge, you know how dry it is, how little water there is. The creeks that I learned to swim in are, no more than 20 feet across. And that was the extent of my relationship with water. But it was critical and meaningful for me. But learning what water meant within these communities, the migration story that Jeffrey already told you about, we heard, oh God, maybe every person had a different iteration of that story. And each one had real depth and real meaning to it, as well as the specific way that wild rice has saved their lives in a variety of different times, in a variety of different ways. And it's an important part and critical part of their communities, their cultures, and their livelihoods. And so becoming a part of that and getting to know it has just been an incredibly beautiful kind of process for me in my life. Just to kind of finish that conversation and maybe actually open it up before I move on to the rest of it. The emphasis that we have on local engagement, for me, really resonated with me whenever I came across the Pope Francis material. What does he call it? Okay. Yeah, the encyclical. And if you guys have a chance to look at that, pay attention in particular to chapter 4 and part 2, cultural ecology, and chapter 5, part 2, dialogue for new national and local policies. Those are two areas where not only does the encyclical talk about indigenous peoples and the role of indigenous peoples within their own communities, but the point of emphasis there is really about local engagement, actively engaging at the local level, recognizing the necessity of a shift from a hierarchical dominance role to one that engages within community and a relationship with the earth. And that is really where we're coming from in thinking about, as we engage different communities, that local approach, that local engagement. And I was wondering, I wanted to take a little bit of time now to open it up to conversation to see if anybody had any thoughts or comments or questions at it at that level.
I wonder if you are familiar with some of the writings of Professor Al Geddes, who has written on indigenous people and his defense of their water mining operations, especially. Are you familiar with any of the books of Dr. Al Geddes?
Can I interrupt you briefly? I apologize. I was worried that the technical logistics wouldn't work for this, and there's a ton of feedback, and I can't understand anything that you're saying. So I apologize that. But the little bit I saw was, little bit that I heard was in relation to line 3 and the pipeline. Is that accurate?
Sorry, let's try it again. We don't have feedback this time, do we?
No, that's good, yeah.
Okay, can you ask that again? Sorry.
Oh, I wondered if you were familiar with any of the writings of Dr. Al Geddes. He's a retired sociology professor from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. He has written a number of books, mainly involving the struggles of indigenous peoples with pollution problems from mining operations.
Hey, Isaac, could you restate the question, please?
Yeah, she was asking if you're familiar with the work of Dr. You said it's Al Geddigs, retired professor from University of Wisconsin La Crosse, and he's written books on what's that?
Indigenous problems with mining waste.
Yeah, he's written books on indigenous problems with mining waste and how it affected their water.
Yeah, I don't know the work of Gettings, so no.
I really would find him an advocate.
You should check him out. He's a
Okay,
good
for
advocate
sure.
for it.
For sure, for sure. If you don't mind, Isaac, could you post that in the comment?
Yeah,
That
I'll
would be
have
cool.
to get help with spelling, I think. Dr. Gedicks. Al Geddigs. Oh, and that was just to you. I'll switch it to all so that anybody who's curious
Okay,
can.
good, good. So while he's doing that, just to round out the conversation about the Institute for the Rights of Nature. Again, as I said, our first effort is within White Earth Reservation, focused on the rights of Monoman legislation, attempting to work with the community to define what that legislation would mean if it was fully applied with regulatory language and regulatory support. We've drafted those materials and are now working on a community education process throughout the community to inform everybody before we approach the White Earth governing body, the Reservation Business Committee, and ask them to implement and support that new regulatory regime, which would be a more fuller implementation of the rights of Monoman legislation. The kind of other aspects of our work is a recognition that on a regional, national, and international basis, we really need to recognize that an Indian nation that does something like this is going to do it because it reflects their own cultural integrity and the specifics of their relationship with the earth and what that means to them, how it reflects itself, not only in their laws, but in their daily lives, is a critical component of any effort. Our emphasis is working with tribal governments to ensure policy efforts on rights of Monoman or a specific entity like, or rights of nature or a specific entity like Monoman. And then not only help them to craft that initial language, but to fully implement it with the community, with the appropriate regulations, mechanisms, programs, educational programs, and other things that fully realize that language within the community itself. What you'll see if you follow rights of nature work is organizations will work with a nation or a state or a tribe, and they will establish something like the rights of Monoman legislation. It may be at the legislative level, it may be at a constitutional level. But for the most part, once that is adopted, it's crafted and adopted, the work seems to be done there. And so what you have is language that's on the book, but never gets fully realized within the community and at the ground level. And so that level of work is what our focus is. The second phase, though, is just as important because of the nature of our ecosystems. Borders don't mean much, right? And the water will flow across borders, the air will blow, etc. And so especially if it's an indigenous community, which we focus on because indigenous communities have sovereign authority, have legal authority within the land base that they have that authority with. And there's a whole bunch that we can go into about federal Indian law, the racism of federal Indian law, and the limits that are placed on that authority. But within those reservation boundaries, on those lands that are tribal lands, the tribe has full jurisdictional authority, and establishing rights of nature provisions and fully implementing it within that is the basis then for having conversations with the surrounding communities, the surrounding counties, the state, and surrounding states. And so that kind of regional emphasis is the secondary part of our effort. And starting with the strength of that tribal community, the authority that they have within their jurisdictional authority over their land to establish and implement those rights of nature provisions, and then using those successes, really specifically evaluating it and assessing it so that there's a clear statement that can be made that, look, this type of rights of nature provision works, and that as an example of success is then the basis for encouraging and pushing and sometimes threatening surrounding communities to adjust their policies and provisions and regulations and laws to comply and match the rights of nature provisions that tribe has established. And then in addition to that, the conversation about rights of nature expands out from there as well. And then those kind of islands of success, which we believe we'll be able to create, will then be able to network together and connect together in a much broader dynamic sort of conversation points. So what we're doing is not trying to engage in national conversation right away. And the core reasons why we're doing that is a recognition that the environmental laws, the environmental protection laws in the United States are completely in the favor of human beings. And the recognition of the earth itself as having a voice, as being an entity whose interests should be at the table with the interests of human beings, that legal basis does not exist in this country. And in order to develop that and evolve into that, I think it's going to be a combination of building these islands of strength where rights of nature is fully implemented and results are being shown, and then networking them together so that we can engage that national conversation, that national policy debate on environmental protection to really engage law reform at the national level in a way that changes environmental laws and balances the human earth interaction so that the scale includes a recognition and a realization of the voice of the earth in that process. And so that's our goal at the national level. And the international engagement is really a concept that we're doing, recognizing that there is a very dynamic and active movement already in place at the international level. The number of countries that have actively developed rights of nature provisions, both at the constitutional level as well as at an ecosystems level, is in the dozens at this point. And so there's a very dynamic international conversation already engaging that we want to contribute to once we have this basis of strength developed and have already started a national debate in this country on rights of nature. So as a whole, that is the kind of approach that we're taking in this. And I'm about 30 minutes in my presentation. And what I wanted to do is leave ample time afterwards for some conversation with the rest of you as well. And what I've done is kind of develop 3 questions for your consideration. And the first I've already talked about quite a bit, why focus on indigenous communities and tribal nations. But the second 2 are stuff that I'm really interested in your guys' input on. On a personal level, what is your acceptance of nature having legally enforceable rights? Is that something that resonates with you in any way at all? And then thirdly, what is your understanding of the importance of the natural world in your understanding of rights? Because I think those two questions naturally go together. And to the degree that you have the capacity within your own life and your own experience, the power and importance of your own personal experience, whether it's fly fishing or something else, you know, my childhood experience that helped me to define what culture meant to me. Both of those, I think, are critical conversations that I wanted to open up with anybody there. So anybody that has any thoughts or questions on any of those areas or others that I haven't covered, just let me know.
I would like to have you read what it says there. I didn't quite get what this last slide is saying.
Hey, Isaac, the audio just doesn't connect from
Yeah,
the
I'll
if you
repeat
could repeat it.
whatever
Great.
questions or statements. She just asked if you would read the questions that are up there on the slide because it's a little hard to see.
Oh, okay. So the first is
I can do that too. Otherwise, since your audio is a little quiet too.
oh, okay. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead, Isaac?
Yeah. So the first question to consider is why focus on indigenous communities and tribal nations. The second question, what is your acceptance of nature having legally enforceable rights? And then the third question to consider, what is your understanding of the importance of the natural world to your understanding of life? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Charlie?
This is kind of focused on the question.
Otherwise, I can repeat it.
Okay.
As long as it's brief, otherwise maybe it wouldn't make more sense for you to come up. Yeah, he should be able to see.
Okay. Now, my question of focus is around the number 2 question there. What is the acceptance of nature having legality enforceable rights? Now, what is your feedback or from the non-Native American communities that you talk about the rights of nature with?
The feedback that I get from non-native communities is really all over the map. Some of the first action that has been taken recognizing nature having legally enforceable rights have come from the United States. Communities at the municipal level recognizing nature of having legally enforceable rights as a strategy or a tactic for attempting to stop a waterway project or a pipeline project or some other activity that they feel threatens their community. And that kind of deep conversation that they had in each of those communities, once they engaged it at the local level, received traction, was the basis of their opposition, was enacted within their city ordinances, and became a kind of organizing and cohesing a process of bringing cohesiveness in the community. And so there's a lot of examples of that. At the same time, from a political perspective, you see a very harsh sort of response to that any conversation about rights of nature, in their view, is a direct attack against capitalism, is a direct threat to the ability of an individual landowner or a business to utilize their land the way they are accustomed to utilizing it. And it is a direct attack to ownership, that this is my land. I will decide what I do and don't do with it. And you should not, the laws should not attempt to limit me in that action. And so there's, really kind of a bipolar kind of response to it in this country in a variety of different ways. But I think the majority of the country hasn't even heard about it. This is not an active dynamic within our country, within the national conversation of our people. And that is something that I think has to be built over time.
I guess one thing that comes to my mind under the second one, you know, in Catholic social teaching, we often talk about rights and responsibilities together, because they're understood as being, you know, dependent on one another, and you know, one without the other. They're mutually they're not understandable without the other. And so one question that comes to my mind, and it partly comes from, actually, I'll share a brief story, which is that in advertising this event, I shared the title of the talk, and that it was about the concept of the rights of nature. And someone who I had shared that with shared with me the fear that they had, that if we talked about nature having rights, then it might we might fall into a pitfall of elevating the rights of nature above the rights of humans. And so from that perspective, I want to ask you, what, if we are thinking of rights and responsibilities as sort of like two sides of the same coin, right? What's the value in, rather than simply saying we as individuals and as communities have a responsibility to protect, you know, wild rice or water or whatever aspect of nature we're discussing. What's the advantage of going beyond the responsibility language and saying nature actually has rights? What's gained in that we don't get in the responsibility?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll be honest with you, this is a question that I struggle with. I have very serious concerns about housing this within a legal construct. I think that the laws, and this is just my own personal study, but once I graduated law school, I briefly attempted to work at a major law firm and lasted for about 6 months. I just couldn't do it. And increasingly throughout law school and in that initial work effort, it became very clear to me that the legal system, and not just the American legal system, but the legal system writ broad, was established, and its core purpose is not to provide justice to the people, but to ensure that the wealthy continue to be wealthy, and that the power of scale of economy is given priority within any legal structure that it's established. And so I shifted my career focus to try to find a balance between education and law. And it really started engaging internationally, and then coming back domestically to the United States. My interest was in, after having worked on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and having seen that adopted, what does it really mean to actually apply those international standards domestically here in the United States? And so I've tried a variety of different things to try to realize that, and this is one of them. But I have real hesitation about housing these rights within a legal system. I have even hesitation about housing them within a rights system. International rights and standards have to be, you know, they're good talking points, they're good words and ideas, but if they're not implemented on the ground, they have little impact. And so the weakness and ineffectiveness of rights mechanisms, even though it can, you know, be a powerful mechanism for evolution, for even revolution, and that's kind of where I'm left. I have a full recognition of their limitation, and a very actually a nuanced perspective on the legal standards within the United States of America. Their ability to, because there's, like, in the way we're focusing on tribal nations, as a starting for establishing rights of nature provisions is a recognition that tribes have sovereign authority within their land base, within their tribal lands. And that power, that authority, that legal authority is an important mechanism for actually establishing rights of nature provisions that can be fully implemented and developed, and under which you can show the success of them or the lack of success, you know? And so I recognize that it's a nuanced perspective, nuanced, that there is no absolute, you know, statement from me that the legal system is corrupt and bad in an absolute sense, because that's not the case, in my opinion. And so you use it to the best of your ability to create a strategic approach. But I'm very much aware of the limitations of a legal basis for this engagement, as well as a rights basis. That being said, within that legal structure, if rights of nature provisions are adopted in the state of Minnesota, for example, and somebody issues that Jeffrey was talking about, of how you know, the first priority is a landowner's authority and legal authority to make a decision about their own land, regardless of the consequence. If rights of nature provisions are established, there is a balancing principle that requires the institution to not only consider the rights of that landowner, but also the rights of nature. And so that as a balancing conversation, is rights of nature provisions established that at the outset. So so it balances that conversation and requires individual landowners, as well as economic projects, to take into consideration from the outset how their project is going to affect nature and what it means to those rights as they're established within that community, how that damage is going to happen, what's the extent, the full extent of that, and what the remediation actions that can be implemented. Right now, it's so easy for corporations to evade remediation. You know, they could do a big, like Zortman Landusky in eastern Montana. They can do a cyanide heap leach gold mine and commit to cleanup afterwards, but they do it through a shell corporation that's underfunded. When they get all the gold out of that, the shell corporation collapses or goes bankrupt. And so there's no corporate entity that is held responsible for that, and they get off scot-free. And so the lands in this country are really set up to support an imbalanced conversations, even whenever there is an obligation to remediation. The structure allows those corporations to get away with virtually no effort and no cost to them to actually remediate. And so it's left to the state or the federal government to try to find the money to do that cleanup. And it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen to anybody's satisfaction. So I think that's the first benefit, positive benefit that you get from a recognition of rights of nature.
Great, thank you.
Others?
Well, we are getting close to that time. I don't know if you had any, I don't know if you're through your presentation, but we're actually past what we said we'd do for the day. So
okay, no problem. I did want to, I know that Jeff had brought up the issue of line 3. Let me just give you an update on that status, and maybe this is just for Jeff as much as anybody else. That litigation was brought against the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the corporation that is managing line 3. And it was brought because the state gave line 3 a huge increase in their water access from something like 5 million to 50 billion feet of water. And just an incredible increase without consideration to the tribe or the impacts on the tribe. The tribe and folks within the community brought a suit against them, utilizing the rights of Minoan legislation as one of the bases, not the only, but just one of them, to assert that claim. They brought it within tribal court. The state DNR tried to remove it to federal court. Federal court said, no, you have to exhaust tribal court remedies. So they went back to tribal court. They lost at the trial court level. The trial court asserted jurisdiction, and they appealed it. Line 3 interstate appealed it to the tribal appellate court. The tribal appellate court reversed the tribal trial court and said that the tribal trial court does not have jurisdiction. The whole analysis that they went through. And my opinion is that they were wrong in their final determination. They used some federal Indian law principles around the Montana exceptions to a general rule within federal Indian law that tribal courts do not have jurisdiction over non-Indians, even within tribal boundaries. That just gives you a glimpse of the racism that exists within federal Indian law. Anyway, there was a motion for the appellate court, the tribal appellate court, to reconsider. In that motion, the Nibby Center and I drafted an amicus brief that gave the appellate court arguments for reversing their decision. But the appellate court affirmed their decision. They didn't accept any of the arguments that we made and that the plaintiffs made to support their motion to reconsider. So as far as that particular litigation, it's over. So that's the status.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Terry, and for your entire presentation. I think I can speak on behalf of everybody in saying it was very enlightening, and it's a new concept. You know, when I heard about it, I was really interested to see what is this all about. You know, I'm familiar with efforts to protect water and other aspects of creation, but the notion of rights is new to me. So I really appreciated this introduction.
You guys pay attention. I really enjoyed the encyclical of Pope Francis from 2015, Laudato Si, I think it's called. Yep. But the language is beautiful, man, and it fully supports the rights of nature. So I was thrilled to read that, and in preparation for this, and I encourage all of you to pay attention to that and get on board.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Terry. Before we conclude, I do want to invite Lisa to come up. She has a brief piece to share about an initiative we're starting at Catholic Charities. And then I have a couple thank yous and announcements, and you can be on your way because I know we've kept you for much longer than you planned already. So.
My name is Lisa Kramer, and I also work at Catholic Charities. Specifically, I work in the Worthington Deanery, so as far west as you can get in our diocese. I just want to quickly acknowledge again the committee that has worked on this so much. We've got Margie and Sally back there, and Father Life is here. Sister Marlis Jacks is with us on Zoom. She's been part of that committee, and Isaac and myself.
And Maria.
And Maria. Maria is not able to be with us here today, but Maria still is part of our program too. So I just want to thank all you guys for all the work you did. Father Life found some awesome speakers for this day, and I didn't even get to hear all of it because I was running back and forth. That's okay. I can watch it when we get the video out. I just wanted to share with you something we're doing starting out in the Worthington Deanery. It's called, I don't know how familiar you are with Worthington, but we have the second largest, we're the second most diverse city in the state of Minnesota. We have a lot of immigrants in Worthington, and many of them have issues of immigration that they're dealing with, documentation. We also have a very large number of unaccompanied minors that come to Nobles County. And so we decided, we've been trying for a while now to try and get things going so that we can bring together people who are concerned about our immigrants and the immigrants themselves and the needs that they have. So what we found is called the CARE program. It actually comes from the USCCB. So it is a program within the church, and CARE stands for Catholic accompaniment and reflection experience. What we are going to be doing is training volunteers in the areas of immigration, and then having them work with some of the immigrants who are facing issues, for example, in court, and who need someone to walk with them through that process. So we'll be training our volunteers just in the general aspects of what that means to accompany, but also we'll be teaching the legal aspects that immigrants run into so that people are more familiar with that, and the spirituality of migration. And so I'm really excited about getting this going, and this is actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the church has designated tomorrow as the World Day of Refugees and Migrants. So it's a good time for us to be praying about that, praying for them, and thinking about this program and other ways that we can support our migrants. So thank you. That's all I need to say.
Thank you, Lisa. And I will include more information on that in the information I sent out in the follow-up.
And there are sheets up here too. If you want to read more about it, we've got some information.
Yeah, please take them home. We got more where that came from. So, and which reminds me, there are other resources on the table, which you probably saw when you came in. Please feel free to grab the copy of the Faithful Citizenship Guidelines from the USCCB. That's the little booklet. And then we also have sheets of paper on the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, which many of you have heard about, but it's a nice little thing. You know, pin it up on your fridge, and it's a conversation starter for people who come over. Other than that, I would just echo the thank you Lisa gave to the committee, also to our speakers. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Terry. And as we already thanked Jeff, since he's out already. Yeah, I would echo all that. It was a wonderful day, a lot of learning. And I think that's pretty much, one of the last announcement, okay, that I almost forgot, is we have a book study coming up, and it's not on water specifically, but it's on the topic of care for creation. And it's from the Catholic bishops of Minnesota, put together a booklet. It's called Minnesota, Our Common Home. And it's based off of the encyclical that Terry mentioned, in which many of you are familiar with, Laudato Si. And so we're going to be starting that, I think it's in 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, something like that. And it's weeknights at 7 to 8:30. Is it Monday nights?
I think we decided on Monday.
Yeah, I believe it's Monday, but I'll include the information from that as well. I just thought if you enjoyed today and you'd like to dive a little deeper on care for creation, that's an opportunity we have coming up. So
We have some folks who have been part of our
studies in the past. Yeah, absolutely. And it will be on Zoom. So with that, I guess, Father, would you lead us in a closing prayer?
Let's pray for knowledge of God's will and the courage to carry it out. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And may God bless you and your families, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father, and thank you to all of you for